Hi there, my name is James Dow, and welcome to Learning Application Deployment with Laravel by Pact Publishing. I have been working with Laravel for maybe 4 years now, and have been developing websites with PHP for over 10 years. I have my degree from Full Sail University in Web Design and Development, and just last year I had a slight change in career when I started working for IBM Design as a front-end developer for their digital experience team. In this video course, we'll look at the basics of application deployment through the eyes of PHP's popular framework, Laravel. This allows us to focus less on the code and learn more about the process. Yes, we'll use live examples to get you set up with the tools you need and how to actually deploy an application. But more importantly, we plan to teach you how to choose the proper tools and workflows for your project, and then how to execute based on those decisions. We'll cover what skills you need going into this course and introduce you to applications you'll be using and the files you'll be using. There are so many different ways to actually deploy an application, but there are even more variables that go into building an application. We'll take a look at the different deployment options and how to choose one based on the different variables in play. We'll talk about some of the most common ways to deploy a website to any common server, for example, GoDaddy or Bluehost. Also, cloud application servers like Heroku and Bluemix are creating traction in the industry because of their flexibility, ease of use, and affordable pricing options. We'll take a look at what they are, how they differ, and how you can deploy your application to one. Deploying a database can be one of the most frustrating aspects of application deployment, and yet it is so crucial to do it, and to do it right. We'll gloss over some of the basics of database deployment to teach you that with a little preparation, it doesn't have to be so scary. We will introduce you to the idea of deploying web applications with a team environment. Some, if not most of these practices are even good to adopt for personal projects. We'll be looking at all of this from a continuous deployment workflow using GitHub. Deploying an application can be a boring, mundane, repetitive, and even scary task, but it's crucial to any successful application. We'll help you to think outside of the box and get creative, and maybe even have a little fun with application deployment. As far as prerequisites go for this course, it's probably a good idea to have a basic understanding of programming concepts. Although we have a video that helps get you up to speed with Laravel, it doesn't hurt to know a thing or two about it before you begin. Also, there will be some specific videos that may focus on the use of Git or Gulp, so it might be a good idea to know a little about them before you get started. As far as deployment concepts, you are expected to know little to nothing in this area. Learning application deployment with Laravel is going to help introduce and ground you in the basics of the many moving parts of a process that every developer has to do eventually. This video course is going to teach you in a way that is fun and engaging, that rids any deployment phobias you may have, and helps get you one level closer to that all-star developer badge. In the next video, we'll start things off by getting you set up with some of the core deployment tools we'll be using throughout the course. Hi there, and welcome to the first section. In this section, we'll be introducing you to the required tools we'll be using throughout the course. More specifically, we'll look at setting up some of the core tools developers use for deployment, expanding and setting up our deployment toolset, and then finally we'll end with looking at our exercise files, and get a little primer to Laravel in case you're unfamiliar or maybe a little rusty. So by now you should have already watched the course overview and have a pretty good idea of what we'll be doing. In this video, we'll be setting up core tools that we'll need throughout the course. There are many different tools out there we can choose from, but these are some pretty common ones that developers use for the core deployment techniques we'll be learning. We'll start off by looking at possible hosting options for the course, and then we'll dive into installing the actual software like FileZilla, MySQL, Workbench, and MAMP. Then we'll wrap things up by setting up Laravel. To start off, we need some place to host our files. Feel free to use a hosting service you may already have. Find another hosting service or use the one I'll be using throughout this course. The only requirements is that it allows SSH, runs Apache with PHP 5.5.9 in order to use the latest version of Laravel 5.1, and allows us to edit .htaccess. Most cPanel hosting services should work. I personally use Bluehost on a day-to-day basis. If you don't already have a web hosting service, and you don't feel like you're ready to commit and pay for one, you can use a number of free services out there. Grindle Hosting at grindlehosting.com is one of those free web hosting services that I came across while recording. And for learning purposes for this course, you'll be able to follow along for a good portion of it, although you might have trouble keeping up when we talk about doing anything with SSH. This is very common in these free services, so I recommend using a paid one if you have access to one. And if you're a highly motivated individual, you could also use Laravel's Homestead as a server stand-in or proxy. You just have to go to laravel.com/docs, and if you scroll down a little, you'll see a section for server requirements with a link to Laravel Homestead. It's more appropriately used for a development environment, and a powerful one at that, built specifically for Laravel. Learning how to get set up is a bit more complicated and out of scope for this course, but it's a free service that may aid you in following along. If you love Laravel as much as I think you do, then learning Homestead will happen at some point. You might as well learn now. We'll be using FileZilla for any of our FTP needs in this course. So let's go to filezilla-project.org. You should see a big button that says Download FileZilla Client. Double check it says Client and not Server. I've made the mistake of clicking on the Download Server link. It's just an unnecessary headache. Now click on the Download FileZilla Client button. This button will take you to another page where you can click on another button to download FileZilla from SourceForge. Not the best user experience, but it gets the job done. After a couple of seconds, you should now see the file in your download bar. After it finishes downloading, you should be able to click it to unzip the file. FileZilla should now be sitting in your Downloads folder. Just double-click it to launch the application, or you could drag it and drop it to your Applications folder. Later on in the course, we're going to do some basic database deployment. So we'll need some software to help manage our database. We're going to use the MySQL Workbench, if for no other reason than because it meets our needs, and it can be downloaded on multiple operating systems. So let's go to the page mysql.com/product/workbench. Go ahead and click the Download Now button. That button will take you to the page where you can select the appropriate software for your operating system to download. Towards the bottom of the page, select your operating system and click Download. This will take you to a page where they'll try to get you to log in or to create an account with them. You should be able to skip this step though. Towards the bottom of the page, just click No Thanks. Just start my download. It might take a couple minutes to finish, but once it's done, go ahead and open up the installer you just downloaded. Drag and drop the MySQL Workbench into your Applications folder, and you should be done. Just find it in your Applications folder to open it. If you don't currently have a way to run an Apache server on your computer with PHP, MySQL, and phpMyAdmin, then I highly recommend using MAMP at mamp.info for a local server. Especially if you're new to all of this, because it's easy to set up and just as easy to use. So go ahead and click Download on MAMP. Make sure it's not MAMP Pro. It'll take you to this next page where it'll ask you what operating system and version you would like to install. You'll probably be good just downloading the top option, so click Download again. It may take a second to download, but when it's done, you can go ahead and open it up and walk through the installation process. When it's done installing, you can navigate to your Applications folder where you'll see MAMP and MAMP Pro. I personally like to delete MAMP Pro because it's a free trial that they're trying to sell you on. Before we move on, if you open up the MAMP folder, you'll see a child folder called htdocs. Throughout this course, this is most likely where you want to store your Laravel project files. This is the default location that MAMP sets up for you to serve your files, but you can customize this within MAMP settings if you would prefer. Now, Composer is one of those tools any PHP developer should have, but more importantly, Laravel uses it for its dependencies. That means we need to download and install it. So go to getcomposer.org. Once you're there, you can then click on Download. This will take you to a page with instructions on how to download and install Composer. Copy the line of code it asks you to run in your terminal. Open up your terminal, paste it in, and hit Enter. If it says everything was successful, then that means it was. But just in case, we can always type in composer -- version, just to make sure it's working though. If you're getting a version number similar to what I have on my screen, then that means it's working, so great job. Finally, the last thing we want to install is Laravel. So go to laravel.com and click on Documentation and the Navigation. If you scroll down the page just a little, it'll tell you how to install Laravel using Composer. So copy this line of code, and then open up the terminal. Now paste it into the terminal and hit enter. Once Composer has finished installing Laravel, we can set up the simple Laravel command line by creating an alias in our bash profile. To do this, we need to open our bash profile in a text editor. In our terminal, we can use the open command with a path to our bash profile and hit enter. In your text editor, just type in alias Laravel equals, and then put in your path to your Laravel bash file and hit save. Restart your terminal, and to verify that you got it working, type in Laravel -- version. If you're seeing a version number similar to what's on my screen, then that's it. You're ready to move on to the next video. Great job! So the core software we'll be using throughout this course has been installed, and you're good to go. In the next video, we'll look at expanding our toolset for some of the more advanced topics of this course. Welcome back to the video titled Expanding the Deployment Toolset. In the last video, we set up some of the software that developers use to deploy their application. In this video, we'll look at adding to that list of tools. These tools might be considered as more optional or advanced tools to use in your deployment workflow. Needless to say, this video will help prepare us for some of the more advanced topics of this course. We'll first cover installing Node.js and NPM. Then we'll move to Gulp. We'll wrap things up by installing and setting up our required CLIs for Heroku and Cloud Foundry, or otherwise known as Bluemix. Installing Node.js and NPM on your computer is going to be necessary to install Gulp next. But don't fret, because it's not complicated. To start, just go to nodejs.org. On the home page, there should be a large button that allows you to download Node.js. Let's go with a mature and dependable option. This should download a package which you can click on to open. An installer will pop up, and you have to just follow the instructions to complete the installation. Go ahead and click Continue to get started. Once you get a window that says your installation has been installed successfully, then you should be good to go. But just in case, let's open up the terminal to make sure we installed both Node.js and NPM correctly. Type in node-v and hit enter. If you're seeing something like a version number, then that means you've successfully installed Node.js. Now type in npm-v and hit enter. Again, if you're seeing something like a version number, then that means you've also successfully installed NPM, Node.js's package manager. Now that Node.js is installed, we can install Gulp. Go to gulpjs.com and click Try It Now. You'll be taken to Gulp's Getting Started Markdown file on GitHub. We want to install Gulp globally, so the information we need is on the first step. Copy this line of text, npm install -- global gulp, and paste it into your terminal and hit enter. When it's done doing its thing, type in gulp-v into your terminal to verify it installed correctly. If you get some version numbers like I have on my screen, then that means you have successfully installed Gulp, so great job! We'll be going through how to deploy your site onto Heroku in one of the videos. To follow along, you'll need to create a Heroku account. So go to heroku.com and click Sign Up for free. That'll take you to another page where you can input your account information and create a free account. Type in your first and last name, email and company name, and click Create Free Account. It's then going to ask you to check your email to confirm your account. Check your email and look for an email titled Confirm Your Account on Heroku. Open it and click on the link to confirm your account on Heroku. Now you need to set your password. Note it's a minimum of 8 characters. It can be any combination of letters, numbers, and symbols. Click Set Password and log in. That's it, you're all done. Just click on the link to continue to your account. Now, in order to deploy a Laravel application on Heroku, we're going to need to download and install the Heroku toolbelt. This is actually going to help us out and save us a little time by also installing Git for us. So go to toolbelt.heroku.com, select your operating system, and click the Download Heroku Toolbelt button. This is going to download a package file. Just double-click on the file you just downloaded, and it'll launch an installer. Just follow the instructions to install the Heroku toolbelt. Click Continue to get started. That's it. Hit close and you're done. Just to be sure, let's open up our terminal to verify everything got installed correctly. Type in Heroku version and hit enter. If you get like a version number, then Heroku's CLI command line interface was installed correctly. Type in Git version and hit enter. Again, if you get a version number similar to what I have on the screen, you have successfully installed Git. Great job! You've successfully installed Heroku's toolbelt and saved a couple steps in the process. Another one of our videos will teach you how to deploy a Laravel application to Bluemix. So we'll need to create an account and download and install the Cloud Foundry CLI command line interface. Let's create the account first by going to bluemix.net and click on Sign Up in the top right corner. This will take you to another page where you'll create an IBM ID account. Fill out the required form fields and click Create Account. The next screen will tell you to check your email. I'm not going to lie, it may take a while to receive this email. Just wait patiently for this email while you continue the course. Next, you'll need to check your email for an email titled Please validate your email address to access IBM Bluemix trial. When you get it, click on the Validate Email Address button in the email. This will take you to a login page where you can enter your IBM ID account credentials you just created. Click Login. It'll then redirect you to your Bluemix account. Now, in order to deploy anything to Bluemix, we'll need to download the Cloud Foundry CLI. So let's go to github.com/cloudfoundry/CLI/releases. Click on your appropriate installer from the list of installers. This will download a package that you can then click to open. An installer will pop up. Just follow the instructions to complete the installation and click Continue to get started. That's it. The Cloud Foundry CLI tool should now be installed. Go ahead and click Close. Let's open up the terminal just to make sure it's working. Type in CF-V and hit Enter. If you're getting a version number similar to what I have on my screen, then that means everything is ready to go. Now that all of the software we'll be using is installed appropriately on your machine, we can continue to the final video of Section 1, where we will help you get familiar with the exercise files we will be using. Welcome back. This is the final video of Section 1. We've just installed all of our required software, and now this video is going to quickly get you familiar with the Laravel project files we'll be using. We'll learn how to create a new Laravel project and look at its file structure. Then we'll learn some Laravel basics like routing and views to get your hands a little dirty. So let's get started. First, we're going to learn how to create a new project in Laravel. There are two ways of going about doing this. 3, if you want to clone the repository and manually do all the configurations, but we'll ignore that option for now. Both of the options are listed in the documentation on Laravel's website, and both options are going to require the terminal. We can either use Composer to create a project, or we can use the Laravel's command line interface. The first method mentioned uses Laravel's command line interface tool, so open up the terminal. We need to create this in our Apache space so we can access it locally, and if you are using something similar to MAMP, which I recommend for beginners, then your path name might be similar to application/mamp/htdocs. Now just type in Laravel new and give your project a name like My First Project and hit enter. If the terminal says application ready, then that means your project was created successfully. You can confirm this by typing in ls. If you see your app listed there, then it was a success. Easy enough, right? Just for kicks, let's try creating a project with a Composer method. Go back over to Laravel's documentation and copy the provided command from Composer. Paste this into the terminal, give it a project name like My Second Project, and hit enter. When it's done, it should be installed correctly. You can verify you did everything correctly again by typing in ls. If you see your new project, then it was successful. Not quite as elegant, but it gets the job done. Going forward, we'll be using Laravel's command line interface tool throughout this video course, but feel free to use the Composer tool if you would prefer. One of my favorite features that Laravel brings to the table is its elegant routing engine. It's quick and easy to implement and even faster to understand. In the documentation search bar, you can type in routing, and the routing documentation will be at the top of the list. Right at the top of that page is the basic routing section. This is all we're going to need for right now, but I encourage you to take a look at the rest of the documentation as you get time. Go ahead and use your Finder to navigate into your project's app/http folder. Routes.php file is where all of your routes need to be executed, so go ahead and open it up into your favorite text editor. You can see you already have a route created. Look at the slash. That's going to be our root URL, and it's returning our welcome view. If you go to your local host at myfirstproject/public, you can see the route in action. But if you copy the current default route and paste it underneath, and then modify the URL to something like hello, then you can even return some custom text like hello world. So to see what you just did, you can see your new route in action. Just go back to your local host at myfirstproject/public/hello. We can also separate some of our logic and try to follow more of a model view controller feel to our Laravel application by creating a controller and attaching it to a route. The documentation tells us that our controllers can be found at app/http/controllers. Now we can create a new controller manually, or we can use the awesome PHP artisan command to generate one automatically. Just give it a name like Hello Controller. Open up this newly created controller in your favorite text editor. Now the artisan command generates a lot of awesome public functions within the controller, but all we need right now is the index function. Within that, return hello world. Now back to your routes file we were in a second ago and create a new route to attach the controller we just created. Give it another route like hello again, and instead of using an anonymous function, we'll attach our controller directly with the hello controller at index. To see if it's working, let's visit our local host again at myfirstproject/public/hello again. Now that we understand a little about controllers and routes, let's build a simple view using the Laravel's Blade templating engine. The documentation tells us we place our views into the resources/views folder. We're going to create a basic hello.php file that echoes a variable hello. Now go back to our routes.php file and create another route called hello my name. This time, we'll return a view function that accepts two arguments: the name of our view, hello, and an array object of variables. In this case, we'll add a variable called hello and give the value of hello my name is James. So go to your local host at Laravel app/public/hello my name to see it working in action. So now that we've created a basic view, route, and controller, let's try to put it all together and create a basic route that attaches a controller that returns a view that extends a layout. Whoa, let's do this. Let's start off by creating a new controller using that nifty artisan command we learned earlier, and give it a name like hello. In the index function, we want to return a view function that extends a new layout view that we are about to create. And we can go ahead and pass in a title variable and a p variable while we're at it. Now we want to create two new files within the resources/views folder. Create a hello layout.blade.php and a hello content.blade.php. Because we'll be using the Blade templating engine, we need to use the extension .blade.php instead of just the .php. Our hello layout.blade.php doesn't need to be fancy, just a basic layout with a header that echoes our title and a placeholder for hello content.blade.php to leverage. Our hello content.blade.php needs to extend the hello layout we just created. Then we need to create a section for content. Basically everything we want to go in the yield function content needs to go in here. We'll print a paragraph that echoes the p variable we're passing to it. Finally, let's go back to our routes.php file and add a new route that makes the magic happen. Create a new route, something like hello/world, and we'll attach the hello controller and run the index function. You can see the final outcome at myfirstproject/public/hello/world. Great job! Now that we've become a little more intimate with Laravel, we can cross this section off our list. We've installed all of the necessary tools to follow along with this course, and we're also familiar with the Laravel project files we'll be using. In the next section, we're going to look at different deployment methods and how to choose the best one for our project and team's needs. Welcome to Choosing a Deployment Method, which is the second section of learning application deployment with Laravel. In the previous section, we became more familiar with expectations and files for the video course. In this section of the course, we'll learn how to choose the proper deployment method and technologies for our project needs. We'll briefly learn about the life of an application from beginning to end. We'll navigate through some of the basic considerations when choosing a deployment method. We'll also take a look at what type of hosting environments are available. And then we'll finally wrap this section up by talking about the different tools out there, built with deployment in mind. This is the first video of Section 2, Life of an Application. It's important for us to learn about a basic application's life to better understand where deployment belongs in the picture. So in this video, we'll be looking at the basic flow of an application to see a timeline of the application's life. After that, we'll decide where deployment should be introduced on the project's timeline, and how frequently it should be applied. Every application is born as an idea or an assumption. This idea or an assumption then enters a research phase of the application, where the problem must be clearly defined and understood. This is maybe where users are interviewed to help guide the application. As the application matures with understanding, the research phase allows for exploration and more ideation around the problem based on the user's needs. This is where wireframes and UI designs might give the application character. Once the application is mature enough, there is ideally a stage in its life where some of the wireframes and designs begin to be built out as prototypes. This is a stage of life for the application where its personality begins to shine and interactions can be built upon. Finally, the application is ready to be evaluated and tested based on the user research. If it passes all of the checks and balances, then it's ready to be built out and deployed to server. Maybe the application is fully mature at this point, but most likely only certain aspects of the application are mature enough for deployment. At this point, the application maybe goes into the cycle of understanding, exploration, prototyping, and evaluation. It's constantly being iterated upon and evaluated. Throughout this long and sometimes endless seeming cycle, certain aspects of the application have matured enough to be deployed. After many iteration cycles, the application may finally be mature enough to release its version 1. The cycle may continue until it reaches version 1, version 2, etc., etc., etc. Now, the life of an application may be different from project to project. Some applications mature more quickly than others, and that's okay because no application is alike. So this is really interesting, but does beg the question, when is deployment technically introduced, and how frequently should it be pushed live? Ideally, you and your team will be thinking about many things throughout the very early stages of the application's life. Before the app has even been designed, you and your team should be thinking about things like where it should live or what type of languages, frameworks, preprocessors, version control, security, accessibility, performance, and the list can go on and on. Along with that list is your deployment solution. As the application matures, your deployment strategy may change, and that's okay. We'd love to nail everything down on the first try, but realistically, it rarely happens. That's why we have things like research and iteration. If you begin to think about deployment solutions and strategy from the very beginning of your application's life, then hopefully you'll figure out the magic solution after your first few deployments. The last thing you want to do is wait until your application is fully mature to version 1 and start looking for a deployment solution after the application has already been built. That usually leaves not enough margin for error, and you're scrambling at the last minute before your deadline. The earlier you start thinking about it, the better. As far as the frequency of your deployments throughout an application's life, it's really up to you. I know it's a pretty lame answer, but it's really whatever works for you and your team. I've heard of some teams that have deployment schedule where they deploy code every quarter. Some teams try to deploy once a week. Other teams deploy their application every time they push something to GitHub. Others deploy whenever they feel good and ready. But some teams set automatic deployments, while others prefer deploy manually. There are pros and cons to each way, and we'll try to touch on some of them as we continue throughout the course. I personally can't say one is better than the other, because it seriously depends on the situation. A good rule of thumb is as long as it gets your application from point A to point B, then it's a win in my book. So now that we've learned a little more about an application and how deployment relates to a project's timeline, we can move on to the second video of Section 2, where you'll learn some considerations when choosing a deployment method for your application. Hi again, this is the second video of Section 2, titled Things to Consider. In the previous video, we talked a little about the life of an application, and where deployment commonly lives on an application's timeline. This video is going to introduce you to some basics to keep in mind when choosing a deployment method. We'll learn how to evaluate our project and team needs when building and deploying the application. Also, where the application will be hosted may affect what deployment method we choose. Finally, we want to find a solution that is easy to use, frictionless, secure, and will scale as our application grows. One of the last things we want to do is to have to throw away the hosting or deployment methods 2 months after now because our solution didn't scale. When it comes to choosing a deployment solution, there are a couple things I like to consider. Like, who is going to actually be doing the deployment? Is it going to be me? Someone else? Or maybe it's going to be more than one person, like a team of individuals. Usually you don't want any more than 2 or 3 people standing in between your dev environments and your production site. The more people you have, the more complicated and confusing things can tend to get, which in turn may potentially cause undesirable bugs. Nonetheless, if it's just you, then by all means choose whatever you're comfortable with. On the other hand, if it's another individual or team, then I would include them in on the decision making. If not, send them this video course and pawn the decision off on them completely. Another question I like to ask myself when choosing a deployment solution is, what tools am I already using? Do any of them have deployment either built in or have a feature that will help me deploy more easily? Almost everyone uses Git, and in that case, it's probably a no-brainer to use Git hooks. Or maybe you're using a task runner like Gulp or Grunt. You could easily set up a task runner to deploy your application if a certain task is run. Even languages like PHP or frameworks like Laravel have certain built-in functions that can potentially make our life easier when deploying an application. The last major consideration, in my opinion, is where will the application actually live? Deploying an application could be as familiar as sticking a thumb drive into your computer, dragging and dropping your files onto the thumb drive, carrying your thumb drive over to the server room, and plugging it into your server and running. Now, maybe that method is a little impractical, but it will get the job done. The point I'm trying to make is, depending on where your application may or may not live, might actually influence your decision when choosing a deployment solution. Most web servers will allow some of the more common file transfer techniques like FTP or SSH, while others like Bluemix, for example, requires the Cloud Foundry command line interface tool to deploy a web application. These are only a couple of things to consider before choosing a deployment solution. Others might be things like security or performance or even scalability. The list can go on. But now that we have a better understanding of what we're looking for in a deployment solution, we can move on to the third video of section 2, where we'll take a look at the different types of hosting environments available and some of the pros and cons of each type. Welcome back to the third video titled Hosting Environments of section 2. In the previous video, we talked about basics to keep in mind when choosing the right deployment method for your project, and in this video, we're going to look at the different types of hosting environments available for our application. We'll be looking at web hosting environments primarily, but we'll also look at cloud application providers hosting your own server and even some non-traditional hosting environments. There are so many options when choosing a web hosting provider. For example, SiteGround, or InMotion Hosting, iPage, Bluehost, Arvixi, Green Geeks, HostGator, A2 Hosting, Site5, and many, 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 many more. And this is just a random top 10 from a Google search. This is just the beginning. On one hand, it's really nice to have all of these options because surely you can find one that fits your needs, right? On the downside though, in order to find that perfect web hosting provider, you'll need to shift through tens of hundreds of thousands web hosting providers out there. Looking for a web hosting provider in and of itself could be a full-time job. And after researching your third or fourth option, you might come to see a pattern. There isn't that much of a difference between each service, and sometimes the services are absolutely identical. One provider may have one domain with unlimited storage, which by the way usually isn't unlimited, while another might have 3 domains and unlimited subdomains for the same price as the previous web hosting provider. Depending on your application, all of this may be all you need, and I say that's great because it's easy to sign up, it's easy to pay, set up, and deploy. But some of these services may even have a half-decent support system for you as well. But sometimes you'll need special software and hardware to run your application. That opens the doors to all kinds of new web hosting providers that specialize in a very particular kind of web hosting. For example, Media Temple prides itself on being the perfect hosting provider for WordPress-based sites. Then there's Rackspace, which will host your web application based on the CDN. Then of course, no web hosting provider list would be complete without Squarespace, that allows you to build beautiful websites through their WYSIWYG. But I digress. I use Bluehost for my day-to-day web hosting needs. It's affordable and has a great support. At the end of the day, it just plain out works. The cool thing about most of the web hosting providers is that majority I've personally used make use of the cPanel. So switching providers from one project to the other is made a little easier because what UI you may be using is very similar. Finally, what you'll see with a little research is that most of these web hosting providers thrive off of Apache. So finding support for .NET, Ruby, or Node.js isn't impossible, but it may require a little extra searching or even configuration. Now this works great for you because since the course has with Laravel in the title, I'm assuming you're either already or wanting to work with Apache. Looking for a web hosting provider just got a little easy for you, or did it get a little harder maybe? Whatever you're looking for, I'm sure you'll be able to find what you need. Now sometimes your site might need more flexibility than what a regular web hosting provider can provide. You need something that will scale with certain hardware and software that may or may not change down the road. But don't worry, there is a solution for you too. You can just build your own server. Easy enough, right? It's not as hard to set up as you might think. We'll look more into this later on the course. But although it may be easy to set up, it's usually a method only reserved for people who know exactly what they are doing, and have a team of IT professionals able to maintain that server around the clock. Large companies usually have outsourced this type of thing. Nonetheless, it can be done, and you get complete control over everything. Hardware, software, upgrades, and access. It's probably the cheapest initial setup without having to worry about ads or software and hardware limitations. But with those awesome pros comes cons like internet reliability. So if your internet goes offline, so does your website. Noise and heat. What it really boils down to is that it comes back to you, and there is no support to help you troubleshoot a problem you're having. You're on your own, whether that's for the better or worse until death does us part. Building your own server will allow you to choose from just about any to all deployment tools you see and read about in this course. But wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a happy medium between flexibility of building your own server and the support and easy setup of paying for a web hosting provider? In this circumstance, you can actually have your cake and eat it too. That's where cloud application providers come into play. They're like this perfect hybrid of the two different options. In this video course, we'll learn how to deploy to Heroku and Bluemix. But that only scratches the surface. This type of hybrid cloud application hosting is beginning to grow in popularity over the traditional web hosting providers. For example, Google Cloud Platform, Amazon Web Services, or otherwise known as AWS, and Windows Azure are just a couple to name a few other options. One thing to consider about hybrid cloud application providers is that they tend to have their own deployment tools via the command line interface. So you may not be able to use SSH or FTP to deploy your website if that's what you're familiar with. It's a small price to pay for better scalability, flexibility, and support. As you can see, it's important to weigh the pros and cons of the hosting environment you'll be using, because it may leave you with too many options to choose from, or it may make the decision for you. In the next video, we'll look at some deployment tools you might be able to make use of and their pros and cons. And we're back with the final video in section 2 called Deployment Technologies. In the previous video, we looked at different types of hosting environments and when we might want to use one over the other. In this final video of section 2, we will look at primarily at the deployment tools we'll be using throughout this course. But we'll try to save some time at the end to look at some tools worth mentioning that we won't have time to cover later in the course. It's been a while since I personally used FileZilla. In my honest opinion, FileZilla is great, if not the best tool for new web developers just starting out and learning about deployment. The reason I say that is because it is relatively easy to set up and configure. Except for cloud application servers, I've never came across a web hosting provider who didn't support FTP. But the number one reason I think it's so great for beginners is because it provides the user with a GUI they're familiar with, a common folder structure. It's important to note that using FTP has its downsides though. It's not the most secure method because it doesn't encrypt transferred files over SSL or TLS, but that's what FTPS and SSH is for, right? The bottom line is that it gets the job done, and sometimes that's all you need, especially when you're just starting out and learning the ropes. If security is your primary concern, SSH may be the direction you need to take. Although it may be just a bit slower than FTP because it's encrypting your files on transfers, it's more secure because it's encrypting your files on transfers over SSL or TLS. If you would like to deploy your website using SSH, you have to be careful when choosing a web hosting provider. Sometimes the hosting provider doesn't allow for SSH access because this would allow you to do all kinds of awesome stuff like installing Git onto your web server, for instance. This is obviously more common around free web hosting plans, but it is something you should pay attention to just in case. Git in itself is not a deployment tool. It's a type of version control tool. What Git does have is a feature called Git hooks. The easiest explanation I can come up with is that it's basically an event listener for Git commands. So for instance, you can create a custom Git hook that fires a script to deploy your application whenever you push to your master branch. At the moment, Git is the industry go-to tool for version control. If you're not already using Git within your normal workflow, then you are doing yourself, your team, and your project a huge disservice. I strongly advise you to use it. If you're already using Git, then using webhooks may be a no-brainer. Like Git, Gulp isn't a deployment tool by itself. It's a task runner for development. You can use any other popular task runners like Grunt to accomplish the same goal. The only reason I'm using Gulp is because that's what I use in my work. Like Git, you can set Gulp up to listen for certain tasks to deploy a project. One of the cool things about using Gulp is that you have the power of Node.js at your fingertips. If you're familiar with JavaScript, you may be able to do some pretty cool things when it comes to deploying your project. You can make use of FTP, SSH, Git hooks, rsync, and so much more. Gulp gives you a wide array of flexibility. And in all honesty, it's very similar to using a Git hook. But I think what Gulp has over Git hooks is its library of plugins and the community that supports them. So to set up a Gulp command that runs a test and then deploys to your website is as simple as installing a dependency to your Gulp cat task runner. A plugin like Git Guppy would even let you create a task in Gulp, and it would automatically generate a Git hook for you to use. So instead of running git push and then gulp deploy, git push fires gulp deploy with a gulp plugin and some JavaScript. Talk about a tongue twister. Both the Heroku and Cloud Foundry command line interfaces are going to be the main tools of choice when deploying to either Heroku or Bluemix. It's also the easiest tool to get up and running with. There are a couple of ways to get around this though, but it depends on how far you really want to take things. Git hooks would be the first alternative deployment tool I would consider using, but it takes a little effort to set up. We'll learn a little more about them in the next section. If you're already using Git, this may be a great alternative to using Heroku's and Bluemix's out-of-the-box deployment method. There are tools to kind of hack yourself an SSH tunnel to Bluemix or Heroku, but because these systems weren't really built the same way as your traditional web host, you may run into some problems. I've personally never been able to get SSH into my Bluemix or Heroku applications before. But the point I'm trying to make is that your alternative options when deploying to Heroku or Bluemix are pretty limited, so the decision is basically already made for you. Laravel itself has some interesting tools you can use and build straight into your Laravel application. For example, you can run Laravel's SSH service using PHP and run the command line from your server within your application. This opens the doors for a lot of things like Git, rsync, FTP, FTPS, SFTP, and so on and so forth. Basically, this service allows you to use every method we talk about in this course and build it directly into your Laravel application. Don't worry, we'll have some fun with this service later. So Rocketeer is an interesting one that someone brought to my attention recently. It's a modern PHP task runner and deployment package. Although a little different if you think of a Gulp version for PHP instead of JavaScript, that's kind of what Rocketeer is. Capistrani is a deployment tool written in Ruby. Then you have Deployer or Deploybot, and so on and so forth. There are tons of tools out there. I'm sure you'll either be overwhelmed or find the tool perfect for you, your team, and your project to deploy your next Laravel application. Now that you understand the basic life of an application, and understand the environment deployment tools and other considerations, you're ready to start applying this type of thinking to your own projects and choose your own deployment solution that works for you and your team. In the next section of videos, we'll be looking more closely at some common tools from configuration to deploying a Laravel application to a web hosting provider's server. Hi there, and welcome to Deploying to a Web Host Server. In the previous section, we tried to understand the relationship between an application and its deployment method a little better, and ways to help you decide on a solution for your project's needs. In this section, we'll be learning how to deploy your Laravel application to a basic web host server using different tools and techniques. We'll start off easy with some of the basic deployment solutions out there, like FTP and SSH, before we gradually get into more complex but versatile solutions like Git and Gulp. This is the first video of Section 3, where you'll learn how to deploy your Laravel application over the File Transfer Protocol, otherwise known as FTP, using FileZilla. Since FileZilla was installed earlier in the course, we'll get you set up by configuring FileZilla to point at the correct host and account. We'll then deploy your Laravel application and at the end, test it to make sure it worked. Before we do anything, we need to create a new Laravel project if you do not already have one. Open up Terminal and type in Laravel new, give it an app name like Laravel-FTP. First, log into your web hosting account. We'll need to collect the appropriate information to point FileZilla to while deploying our application. You'll need your website provider's host name or IP address, username, and password. Most of this information can usually be found on either the left or the right sidebars of our cPanel or Management Center. Next, open up FileZilla and click on the Site Manager icon. Create a new site and give it a name like Laravel-FTP. Enter your host name. Change encryption to only use plain FTP. Feel free to use SFTP if your server is set up for it. Change logon type to normal and enter your username and password. Then finally click Connect. So let's get familiar with the UI real quick. Right below the header icons is basically a status or log section. This is going to tell us exactly what FileZilla is doing and whether it was successful or not. The main left column is going to be our local computer's file system. The main right column is going to be our remote server's file system. This is why I like FileZilla and why I think it's great for beginners. It takes something like deploying a website and wraps it in an interface that is somewhat familiar to anyone who has used a computer before. Finally, at the bottom of the UI, there's going to be your queue. And it's going to show things like what files are going to be uploaded, what files are currently being transferred, and then what files are currently waiting to be transferred. Finally, we should be ready to deploy our Laravel application. First, using the left column, navigate to the local Laravel application root folder. On the right side, you want to navigate to your public folder. This may be different depending on what hosting provider you're using. In my case, we're already where we need to be. Select the local Laravel project you want to upload. You can then either right-click and select Upload, or you can drag and drop them into the appropriate directory you would like to deploy them to. Finally, we're ready to test our site. Go to your proper URL. For example, mine looks like jamesd.me/laravel-deployment/laravel-ftp/public. Make sure you include public, because it won't run from the root of your application folder. If you see Laravel's default splash page, then that's great. You just deployed a Laravel application using FTP and FileZilla. Now that you've learned a basic deployment solution using FTP and FileZilla, we'll step it up a notch and take you to the terminal, where you'll learn how to deploy an application using SSH. Hi, and welcome back to SSH with Terminal, the second video of Section 3 of this video course. Previously, we talked about how to use FileZilla to deploy your application over FTP. In this video, we'll change tools and the technique. You'll learn how to deploy your Laravel application using SSH within the terminal. We'll start off by quickly exploring some SSH and what it does. Then we'll use SSH to deploy your Laravel application, and then to wrap things up, we'll go back and test to make sure the site is working correctly. SSH, which stands for Secure Shell, was one of those methods or commands in the terminal that I learned, which I'll never forget. It was one of those aha moments in my life where the power of network servers really became evident to me. Before we deploy our application using SSH, or more specifically SCP, which stands for Secure Copy, which utilizes SSH, I want to take a second and let you see what SSH does. If you haven't already, go ahead and open up your terminal. We'll be using it through the rest of this video. Type in SSH, username at hostname, where user is usually your web host username and hostname is usually your domain name. If you're unsure about what information to provide, you can look on your web host cPanel or check with support. Once you get that typed in, hit enter and you'll be prompted for your server's password. And I feel like it's my civil duty to warn you here. When you type your password in, you will not see anything happen, like you're used to when typing in a password. This doesn't change anything. You're still typing in your password, only this adds a little extra something to the security. Great! Now you should see something like the last time you logged in and the username and hostname you provided along with a new path. You can think of this as your server's terminal. Anything you can do in your own terminal on your computer, you can pretty much do here. Type out ls to see your files and to see for yourself. I can't stress to tell you how powerful this is. You can install software on here, you can track files using Git, you can create a private remote repository, you can do all kinds of things. But you can also really mess up your system. So be warned and be careful and have fun. Now that you kind of see what SSH does, we can go ahead and deploy our project. Go ahead and type in exit and hit enter. All we need for the rest of this video is the SCP command. Deploying with SCP and SSH is dead simple. First, create a Laravel project if you haven't already. In your terminal, type in scp-r, the path to your local Laravel project you would like to deploy, username at hostname, colon, and then the path name to where you would like to deploy your application on your server. Do you recognize the SSH aspect of this command? Go ahead and use your username and hostname just like we did in the previous command. And then finally, the -r just sets uploading recursively to true. Hit enter, provide your password, and let the uploading begin. Great job! We're ready to test it and see if it's working. Type in the appropriate URL for your service in the browser's navigation bar. For example, mine is jamesd.me/laravel-deployment/laravel-ssh/public. And if you're seeing Laravel's default splash page, then you've successfully uploaded your Laravel application using SSH and terminal. Now that you know how to use SSH within the terminal to deploy your Laravel application, we'll learn how to deploy an application making use of Git hooks in the next video. Great to have you back! This video is titled Git Hooks. Previously, we learned how to use SSH within the terminal to deploy your application. In this video, we'll learn to leverage Git to listen for an event we specified that will trigger deployment. We'll learn how to set up a Git hook, how to trigger it, and deploy our Laravel application. Then finally, like always, we'll want to test it to make sure it's running properly. This video is going to assume that you are at least familiar with some of Git's basics. If not, this would be a good time to learn a couple basics like adding, committing, and pushing at git-scm.com. You might also find it helpful to skip ahead and watch video 6.1, titled Git Basics, and come back to this video when you have a basic understanding of Git. Before we can do anything, we want to either create a new Laravel project and cd into that folder, or navigate using cd to a current Laravel project we already have. Either way, we want to be inside the Laravel application's root directory. I'm going to create a new Laravel project with Laravel new laravel-git and cd into that directory using cd laravel-git. In order for this to work on the production level, we need to stop ignoring a couple things within our .gitignore file. Type open.gitignore. Remove the vendor folder and .env file from the list of files being ignored by Git. Next, since this whole video is going to revolve around Git, we probably want to initialize an empty repository for our application. In your terminal, type in git init. We want to start tracking these files, so let's add them and commit them to our local Git repository. To start tracking our files, type in git add dot or period. Now we need to commit these files with message using git commit -m, and then we can give it a message like initial commit. Now that we have our local repository set up, we'll need to create an empty repository on our server to where our code will live and be served from. We'll need to SSH into our server to do this, just like we did in the last video 3.2. Type in SSH, username at hostname, where user is usually your web host username and hostname is usually your domain name. It'll prompt you for your password. Remember that as you type in your password, there will be no indication that you're typing on the screen. Next, you need to cd into your public folder. For example, mine is called public_HTML. If you need to, you can type in ls at this point to see what your folder structure looks like. Since I have a folder already set up within my public directory, I'm going to use cd public_HTML/laravel-deployment. Great. Let's initialize our production level repository where our code will be served from. We can do this with git init laravel-git. If you type in ls, you should now be able to see your new repository. We now need to create the central repository that is basically going to control the communication between our local and production repositories we just created. It's also where our Git hook script will live and execute deployment when the proper event is triggered. Now we can create this essentially anywhere on our server, but for security reasons it's considered good practice to not initialize your central repository within your public. Since that's the case, let's go ahead and go back to our home directory using cd and the little squiggly character. To keep things organized, we can create a folder for our centralized repositories. If you don't already have a folder called Git for your Git repositories, then let's go ahead and create one. Type in make directory Git. Use ls to see if you were successful in creating the folder. If you were, cd into it using cd git. To create this repository, we're going to do it just like we did in our last step. The only difference is we want to add .git to the end of the directory name and use --bear. So like git init --bear laravel-git.git. That difference is simply going to let us connect to it from the other repositories here in just a second. Use ls if you would like to verify it worked. So far so good. Now to the juicy part. It's time to write our deployment script as a Git hook. If you look at Git's documentation, you'll see a lot of different types of Git hooks, although the one we need to focus on for this video is post-receive. Basically, with this Git hook, our central repository will wait until it has received the code from our local repository before it will run a deployment script to our production repository. Let's make sure you cd into your new central repository. cd laravel-git.git. If you type in ls to list all of your files in this directory, you should notice a folder called hooks. cd into that directory because there are a bunch of examples in there. That's also where our script is going to live. If you use ls here, you'll see the sample files. Feel free to poke around for a minute. When you're ready to continue, we'll use touch post receive to create our Git hook. Git hooks need to be executable, and right now the file we just created doesn't have that type of permission. We can easily change this by using chmod plus x and then the file name post receive. Now that our hook is created, we need to write our deployment script. The easiest way to edit a file on the server is using nano post receive. So think of this file like an empty terminal screen. You just write out a command on each line and it will be executed in that order. To deploy our application, all we need to do is cd into our production repository and then pull the new files. It's really simple. In order to do that, the first thing we need to do in our script is change our directory to the production repository we recently created using cd and then the path name to our production repository. Since git directory variable within post receive gets in the way of using git in a different directory, we need to unset the git directory variable. It's simple, just add the line unset git directory. The only thing left to do is pull the new files onto production using git pull origin master. To exit and save your script, use the Ctrl+X on your keyboard. When it prompts you to save, type in Y. You may need to confirm the file name. To do that, just hit Enter. And that's it. The only thing that's really left to do is connect our local and production repositories to our central repository. Since we're still logged into our server, let's tackle our production repository first. Change directories over there using something like cd and then the path name to your production repository. In order to connect to this repository to our central repository, we need to add a remote. We can do that using get remote, add origin, and then the path name to our central repository. Now let's move to our local repository and do the exact same thing. Type in exit to log out of your SSH session. Make sure you're in the root of your Laravel project folder and type in get remote add origin, username at hostname, your path name to your central repository. To break down that last part real quick, it's our SSH information if you remember, username at hostname, and the path to the central repository. And then we're done. Based on the Git hook we chose, we simply need to push our repository to our remote server in order to deploy our application. We can do that by executing git push origin master. It'll prompt you for your password. Remember that you won't be able to visibly see the password, so type away. Hit enter and wait. Once the files are done uploading, we're ready to test the application. Go to your appropriate URL. Mine, for example, looks like jamesd.laravel-deployment/laravel-git/public. If you see Laravel's default splash screen, then that means you were successful at deploying your Laravel application. Now that you can deploy a website using Git hooks, we'll look at a similar technique but a different tool called Gulp to deploy our application. Great job thus far! We've made it to the final video of section 3 called Gulp Tasks. In the previous video, we learned how to deploy a Laravel application using Git hooks. Gulp Tasks works very similar to Git hooks, but the access to Node's package manager and wide array of packages that we can easily include into our projects can make for a very powerful testing and deployment solution. So in the video, we'll learn how to leverage Gulp to deploy your next Laravel application. We'll learn how to set up and write a Gulp task, how to trigger that task to deploy your Laravel application, and then at the end, we'll go back to make sure it's running correctly on the server. If you're not already familiar with Gulp, then I highly encourage you to find a basic intro tutorial on the task runner before watching this video. What we are covering is so basic that you shouldn't really need any background with Gulp, but it will help you understand things that maybe I won't have time to explain in this video. So the big thing to keep in mind with Gulp is that it's a task runner. Basically what that means is that it's running off of Node and listening for certain events that we've specified. And when it hears that event, it triggers the function we've defined for it. Go ahead and open up Terminal. We need to use the terminal to help us set up Gulp. Either create a new Laravel project and cd into that folder, or navigate using cd to a current Laravel project you already have. Either way, you want to be inside the project's root directory of a Laravel application. Type in npm init to create a new Node application out of your Laravel application. Yes, I know this is a little contradictory, since this is technically a PHP application. But Gulp runs off of Node, so try to keep an open mind here. It'll ask you for several questions, which for the purpose of this video you can hit enter and ignore for now. Add Gulp as a development dependency for your Node application. npm install --save-dev gulp. Laravel actually comes pre-shipped with a gulp file.js in your root directory, so go ahead and open that up. If you notice there's already some tasks available inside, go ahead and wipe it clean because we don't need it for this video. Now we need to require, or in PHP terms, include a reference to Gulp. Next, require child process.exec node and set it to a variable. Now let's create a new Gulp task. We'll call it deploy, and we'll want to add a callback function. So we've created our deploy Gulp task. Anything we put inside of that function will be executed when the task is run. We want to execute a terminal command with a callback function that passes in 3 variables. Remember the scp command we used in the video 3.2 called SSH with a terminal? We're going to use that same exact command here. Type it in where you see the quotes within the exec function. If you want to be able to see any errors output, then you can add the following console.log lines. Finally, we need to add the callback we passed so Gulp knows the task was successful or not. Awesome! You've created your Gulp deployed task. That wasn't too painful, right? In order to run this Gulp deploy task, all you have to do is type in Gulp deploy in your terminal. Remember, you have to be in your Laravel application's root directory where you set up Gulp. It'll prompt you for your password, and then you'll get a blank screen. Be patient here because it's actually uploading the files, and it may take a little while. The problem is that it's not showing us what it's doing live. We're ready to test it. In your browser's navigation bar, type in the appropriate URL for your Laravel application. Mine looks like jamesd.me/laravel-deployment/laravel-gulp/public. If you see Laravel's default splash page, then that means you have successfully deployed your application using Gulp. It doesn't stop here. There are a number of different ways to deploy an application using Gulp. This was only a basic one to help you get the concept across to you more easily. There are a number of different packages that can use different tools and methods. Then there are also another number of different ways you can trigger your deploy tasks. For an example, you could use Gulp FTP to use FTP to deploy your website using Gulp. I don't recommend that because FTP isn't your most secure option, but if the need did arise, you could do it. Also, you could run a number of tests or formatting like JS-hint and uglify.js, and when it's finished with those, it will automatically deploy your application. The possibilities are endless. I just get excited thinking about it. To quickly review this section, you should now be able to deploy an application using a wide array of different techniques and tools, like FTP and FileZilla, SSH and the terminal, Git hooks, and even Gulp tasks. In the next section, we'll cover 2 very specific deployment cases to learn how to deploy to a cloud application server. Welcome to deploying to a cloud application server. In the previous section, we talked about some of the more traditional methods of deploying an application to a web server. In this section, you'll learn how to deploy your Laravel application on 2 different cloud hosting platforms, Heroku and Bluemix. This first video, we'll be covering deploying to Heroku. We'll cover everything you need to do to prepare your Laravel application, teach you how to deploy it, and then we'll go back and test to make sure it's running properly on the cloud platform. Go ahead and open up your terminal. Most of our work in this video will be done through the terminal. To start off, you want to either create a new Laravel project and CD into that folder, or navigate using CD to a current Laravel project you already have created. Either way, you want to be inside the Laravel project root directory. If you remember video 1.3 from earlier in the course, where we installed the Heroku toolbelt and created a Heroku account, you're going to need to log into Heroku using the Heroku command line interface. In your terminal, type in Heroku login. It's going to ask you for your email and password you created towards the beginning of the course. Just keep in mind that when you enter your password, it will be completely hidden. But just because you don't see yourself typing anything doesn't mean it's not working. Just pretend you're typing your password in with your eyes closed. You need to make sure you have a composer.json and a composer.lock file. This is how Heroku knows this is a PHP application. Your Heroku app needs to know to serve the site from your Laravel application/public directory. To do this, all you have to do is create a new file called procfile. Now open up that file and insert the line web:/vendor/bin/heroku-php-apache2 public into that file. The next thing we'll need to do is initialize an empty Git repository. After we set things up, all we'll have to do is push our Git repository to Heroku, and it'll upload everything for us. So type in git init. We need to add and commit our files to Git so it can keep track of them. You can do that by typing in git add dot, and then git commit -m and give it a commit message like initial commit. We need to create a new application on Heroku. You might be able to think of this new application like a folder on your desktop. For each project, you need a new folder to hold these files. So in order to create a new app on Heroku, type in Heroku create --build pack and give it the build pack URL. The app name is optional. If you choose not to add one, then Heroku will randomly assign it a name for you. The last thing we need to do before we can deploy our Laravel application is set the app key environment variable to a random 32-character long string. We can generate the string using PHP artisan key:generate, and we can set it using Heroku config : set app key, and then copy and paste in the random string we just generated. Great! Our Laravel application is all set up and ready to deploy. As I mentioned earlier, Heroku uses Git to deploy our application. So just type in git push Heroku master, and Heroku will take care of the rest. If successful, then it's time for us to test our Laravel application. In your terminal, type in Heroku open, and it'll launch your website on your default browser. Once your page loads, you should see the famous Laravel splash page. Congratulations! You just deployed your Laravel application to Heroku. Now that you've been able to successfully deploy your application to Heroku, we're going to learn how to prepare and deploy your application to Bluemix. Hello and welcome back. This is the second video of Section 4. Previously, we learned how to deploy a Laravel application to Heroku. And in this video, we're now going to learn how to deploy a Laravel application using an alternative cloud service called Bluemix. We'll learn two ways to create an app on Bluemix, how to prepare a Laravel application for deployment, and then finally, we'll end things by pushing our application live and testing it. To start things off, we need to create an app on Bluemix before we can push our application live. There are two ways of doing this. You can create an app by clicking on the Create App button, or you can create an app through the terminal using the Cloud Foundry command line interface. We'll take a look at the later here shortly, but for the moment we'll focus on the UI because it's the easiest and quickest option for our needs. So click Create App. We're creating a web application, so click on Web, click .php, and click Continue. Give your app a name and click Finish. At this point, Bluemix gives you a really nice step-by-step process that we're going to basically follow throughout this video. And since we installed the CF command line interface at the beginning of this course, we'll need to connect the tool to the account you created earlier, and then you'll want to push your code live. To connect the CF command line interface tool up to your Bluemix account, type in CF API, the URL api.ng.bluemix.net. To log in, type CF login-u, your username. And you can provide a -o organization and a -s space into your terminal as well. In case you're not familiar with organizations and spaces, they are just a way for you to organize your work, especially with a team environment. Imagine an organization is the company you work for, and the space could be specific teams within that company. And then application is a specific project your team is working on. If you don't know what your organizational space is, don't worry. You can just leave those options off for now and it'll walk you through them if it finds it necessary. Input your password when prompted. At this point, both Bluemix and our tools are ready to start pushing code. But before we can push our Laravel application, we have to configure it to make it work properly. If you don't already have a Laravel project, let's go ahead and create one. In your terminal, type in Laravel new and give it a project name like Laravel-Bluemix. Change your directory to your newly created project. To help us save on some upload time and space used, let's create a .cf ignore. Open it and add the 3 lines, composer.lock, vendor, and .env. The last step is to create a new folder called .ppconfig. Change to the new folder, create a new file in there called options.json, open that new file, and then copy and paste these 6 lines of JSON into your options.json file. You can find this in your project files. Since we are ignoring our .env file for sensitive reasons, we need to set some environment variables for our production environment using the CF command line interface tool. In your project root, you can use PHP artisan key:generate to generate a random 32-character app key string. And we can set the app key environment variable on Bluemix using cf set_env, give it the app name Laravel-Bluemix, and then the variable name app key. Before we hit enter, just copy and paste the random string we just generated to the end. Now that our application is configured, it should be ready to push. Type in cf push, the app name, Laravel-Bluemix. Give it a couple of seconds to do its thing, and you're good to go. Just go to laravel-bluemix.mybluemix.net to see if you've successfully pushed your application. If you see Laravel's default splash page, then you're good. Now that we've successfully deployed our application, let's try it again using the CF command line interface. Using the Bluemix UI to create an app was quick and easy, but some people prefer the command line, and with it comes more flexibility and customization when using community build packs. To see what build packs are available, you can go to Create a New App in Bluemix and select the Community Build Packs option. The drop-down will reveal a link for you that will take you to Cloud Foundry's official page of built-in build packs. Or you could just go to the URL on the screen. Anyway, find the build pack you want to use. In our case, we'll be using the PHP-build pack. Once you've found the appropriate PHP build pack, you can copy the URL. Then you're ready to push and create your application using cf push. -m, give it a set of memory like 128 megabytes, and -b, and then paste in the build pack that we just copied. And then give your app a name like Laravel-Bluemix-CLI. Give it a couple seconds to do its thing, and you're good to go. Don't forget to set your app key environment variable. You can use the same artisan command we used earlier, PHP artisan key:generate. And then you can set it using cf set_env. Give it the app name you want to set it, and then the variable name app key that you want to set. And then just copy and paste the 32-character random string. You may have to restage since you're already deployed your code. You can do that using cf restage, the app name Laravel-Bluemix-CLI. Let's check it out by going to Laravel-Bluemix-CLI.mybluemix.net to test your Laravel application. Now notice how we had to define the memory, build pack, and app name to push. Then we had to set the app key and restage. We have to do that every time we want to push our application. Or we can simplify this by creating a manifest.yaml file in the root of our Laravel project. You can learn more about setting up and deploying applications with a manifest within the Bluemix documentation at bluemix.net/docs, and then just search for manifest. All you have to do is use the touch command, touch manifest.yaml, to create the file, and then open it. You can find the manifest I used in this video in your project files. Now all we have to do is type out cf push. Isn't that much better? Again, let's go to laravel-bluemix-yaml.mybluemix.net to test your Laravel application. If you see Laravel's default splash page, then you're good. In this section, we got set up and familiar with using both Heroku and Bluemix. We learned the necessary steps to take in order to deploy our Laravel application and test that everything was running correctly. In the next section, we'll learn some common methods for deploying databases to be used with our Laravel application. Welcome back! This is the 5th section titled Deploying a Database. In the last 2 sections, we learned the basics of how to deploy our Laravel application. One of Laravel's strongest pros is how easy it is to build a database-driven application. So it's only fitting that we devote a little time to learning how to deploy a database. Now, deploying a database in itself is a whole video course. We don't have time to cover everything, so instead we're going to cover the basics, overarching introduction to deploying a database that will help us get started. We're going to learn about database environments, how to actually deploy a database from your development environment to production, and some techniques on keeping our environments in sync with each other. So let's begin. So this is the first video titled Database Environments of Section 5. In this video, we're going to learn about the different database environments and when and why you might need to use them. Then finally, we'll look at some of the pros and cons. It is a common practice to have a production environment and a local or development environment for our Laravel application. The local or development environment is where we do all of our work. And once our application is at a good spot, we deploy it to our production environment where other people can then access our application. Depending on the needs of our application, we may see fit to have other environments, like an alpha or beta, or we can just have as many testing environments as we need. There's nothing really new about this. We've touched on some of these concepts in earlier videos, and we'll try to dive a little deeper later in this course. Database environments are essentially the same concept. The biggest problem I face with using databases in my Laravel application is that my production site has all of the data that my users are using. Now there are ways you can connect directly to your production database. Here is an example of an API that you could create. APIs can basically work like a communication tool between your application and your database. But neither of these methods are really a good idea to develop off of. A very simple change to your database can kill your application on production. You personally may not be affected by the bug you introduced, but your users will most likely be affected by it. Good practice and a solution to this problem is to have a database for each of your staging environments. By doing this, you've separated the users from any development you're doing, which is great because as long as your application is working when you deploy, they shouldn't see any major bugs. But this sadly only introduces another problem. While your users may be constantly updating your database, your local development and testing environments are quickly becoming outdated. This may not be a huge problem depending on the type of data you're storing, but I personally like to work with the freshest set of data available. It also makes fixing bugs easier, and it makes it easier to see exactly what the user is seeing and design or develop to their needs. A solution to all of this may be a hybrid of the two options we just talked about. We may have a database for each staging environment, but we could potentially write a small script or task that syncs all of our staging databases with our production database. This keeps our data current, and it allows us to separate development from production. We'll talk about this later in this section. Now that you have a better understanding about the different database environments and some of the problems that revolve around them, we can move on to more actionable videos. In the next video, we're going to learn how to create a local database for your Laravel application, and then how to deploy it to production. Hi there, and welcome back to the second video of Section 5, called Create and Deploy a Database. In the previous video, we talked shortly about the different database environments, and how complicated it can get when transitioning between the two. So in this video, we're going to start off by configuring Laravel to handle a database, insert and list data from that database, and then finally, we'll wrap things up by deploying both our application and our database. So before we can do anything, we need to first configure Laravel with the right settings. We'll be using Bluemix in this section, so once you create your project, make sure you set it up just like we did in video 4.2 when we deployed to Bluemix. As you can see, I already have mine set up called Laravel-db. Laravel should already have a .env file in the root of your project folder. We're going to use it to hold our environment-specific variables. This will help us protect sensitive configurations in our Laravel application. In your .env file, you'll see a couple variables: db host, db database, db username, and db password. Make sure your db host is set to localhost. You'll also need to fill out your db username and db password. Keep in mind that this is your PHP MyAdmin account and not your computer account. Default for local, which is usually something like root and root. Finally, we need our database, and if you haven't created a database yet, now's a good time as any. If you're using a tool like MAMP as your local server, then you probably can use localhost PHP MyAdmin to do this. Just log in and create a new database. Once you've done that, you can add the database name to your .env file. Now that we're all set up there, let's try to insert some data because right now it's just an empty database. We can probably do this with Laravel, but I find it easier with small projects using the phpMyAdmin interface. So give your table a name. I'm going to call mine users because I'm going to want to insert and list out a list of users on my website. We can also set the number of columns we need. For this, all I want is a first and last name. Then we also want a unique ID, so that's going to be 3 columns. Once you hit go, it'll ask you to configure your columns. Give them an ID, first and last name. You want to set your first and last type to varchar and give them a length of something like maybe 32 characters. Finally, set your ID to auto increment. Those are pretty much the biggest things that you really need to do here right now. Finally, we need to insert some data into our table, and for the purpose of this video, we'll continue using phpMyAdmin for this. When you're all done, you should have a very basic database with data now. Let's create a basic route where we'll call this data and list it out using Laravel. Open up your routes.php file within the app/http folder. I'm going to create a new route called users. We need to first establish a database connection and then select the table we'll be retrieving data from. If we set our connection to a variable like table, then we can continue to use it throughout our project without making a new connection every time. Finally, we want to declare a data variable that selects our data from the database and stores it for later use. For this example, we want to just dump the whole table. Also notice how we're extending our table connection here. We can finish things up by returning our data variable. Test your route in the browser by going to localhost/laravel-db/public/users, and you should be seeing a basic array full of the data within your database table. Before we deploy our application and database, we have to set up our server, kind of like we did with our local server. We need to create a database, table, and columns. Then we need to add the database credentials to our Laravel application. So if you haven't already created an app on Bluemix, do it. We need an application before we can add and bind a MySQL service. Once you have the new application created, we can add and bind a new MySQL service by opening up our application and clicking Add a Service or API. We want to search for a MySQL service, and ClearDB is going to be the option we want. So click on ClearDB. Verify everything is right, maybe give it a name. You may have to restage your application once you add this. At the bottom of your application, you should now see a ClearDB MySQL service. At the bottom of that widget should be a button that says Show Credentials. Go ahead and click on it. There you should see all the credentials you need to configure your Laravel application for production. Take the credentials you see here and enter it into our MySQL workbench that we installed earlier in the course. So let's go ahead and open that up. Up in the top left of the application, you'll see the words MySQL Connections, and right next to that is a plus icon. You'll want to click that to add your new ClearDB MySQL service from Bluemix. You'll want to give your new connection a name and provide it with the appropriate host, port, username, and password. If you would like, you can test the connection. It just makes me feel good inside to see that it was successfully connected. Now we need to connect our new production database to our Laravel application. To do that, we need to open config/database.php. Bluemix and ClearDB have stored our production level database credentials as an environment variable JSON string. So the first thing we need to do is create a small script that grabs that environment variable from ClearDB data configurations and parse it so we can use its values. We can do this at the top of the database.php file. Then we need to set the appropriate configurations. If we add the production environment variables as the second argument, Laravel will check to see if local configurations exist within .env, and if they do not exist, the configurations will then default to production. Now we're ready to deploy our Laravel application to Bluemix. If you have forgotten how to do this, don't worry. Feel free to reference video 4.2, where we learned how to deploy to Bluemix. Since I have a manifest.yaml already set up, all I need to do is execute cf push. So now we need to export the database we built earlier on our local environment. This is also how you can create backups of your database in case something goes wrong while migrating your data. I highly recommend backing up before doing any type of database work at all. If you look up at the top navigation tabs on your localhost/phpMyAdmin, you might see an option called Export. That's exactly what we need, so go ahead and click on that tab. All we need right now is the quick option. Make sure it is a SQL file, and then we're ready to click Go. There are other options under the Custom option, like exporting only the database structure, but for this video, the quick option will work just fine. Now that our .sql file has been downloaded, we're ready to import onto our server. So going back into the MySQL workbench, open up your Laravel-DB production connection. In the left-hand sidebar, click on Data Import/Restore. Browse and select the self-contained .sql file we just downloaded. Select the Bluemix MySQL database we connected to, and click Start Import. It'll then take you to the import progress page where it'll tell you whether it failed or whether it was a success. Assuming everything went as planned, we should now be able to go to laravel-database.mybluemix.net/users and see the exact same screen that we saw on our local host earlier. Now that you know how to create and export a local database and import it to your Bluemix MySQL service, you're ready to move on to learn how to keep these two databases in sync. Hey there, and welcome back to the final video of Section 5 called Synchronized Database Environments. If you remember from the last video, we learned how to set up, configure, and deploy multiple environments for a Laravel application. In this video, we're going to pick up where we left off and learn how to keep those environments in sync after deployment. We'll cover more about exporting and importing, and then the most important part, we'll learn some basic concepts to automate this process, or at least greatly simplify it. In the last video, we talked about exporting our development database and importing it into our production database. So if you remember, this method wasn't really that complicated. Anyone can do it. It does get a little tedious though, and can be frustrating from going from one window to the other. You can alleviate some of that by creating a connection for your localhost phpMyAdmin account in your MySQL Workbench software, but even that doesn't really solve things. What we need is a simpler solution. Maybe a button we can just press that handles the import or exporting for us. Or maybe even if it just did it automatically once a day, I'm going to show you how to simplify synchronization between your database environments now. So if you remember in the last video how we hard-coded our sensitive local database configuration information within the .env file, go ahead and open that file up because we're going to hard-code our production values in there as well. Since that file should be ignored both by Bluemix and Git, it should be relatively safe to store sensitive information in there. Let's create 4 new global variables here with the same naming conventions, but this time let's prepend pro to help distinguish the two sets of variables. If you can't remember how to get your production database credentials for these environment variables, then open up your app on Bluemix. Towards the bottom of the screen, you should see the MySQL Clear DB service you added in the last video. If you click Show Credentials, you'll see the database credential information you need to hardcode into your .env file. When you're all done, your .env file should look something like this. Now we need to create 2 new database connections because right now we have only the default which auto-detects what environment we are on. We need a local and a production connection that doesn't really care what environment we're on. So you'll need to open up config/database.php again. It's not difficult to create. Just copy and paste the default MySQL connections twice and rename them to reflect local and production. The local connection is going to be a cinch. Just remove the second argument from its env functions. The production connection isn't that difficult either. Remove the second argument from each env function, like you did with the local connection. But remember to prepend the env argument with pro. Now we need to create a route that actually does all of that heavy lifting for us. In your app/http/routes.php file, create a new route. I'm going to call mine sync. If you want to, your route can accept two parameters, from and to. These will be references to your database connections we just created. This will allow you to sync in either direction without going route happy. We need to establish our connections. Notice how we're using the route parameters we just declared in the last step. At this point, it might be a good idea to add another parameter to our route called table. This way you can specify in the URL what table you would like to sync. Next, we need to get the data from the database we are exporting from, and format that data in a way that Laravel can consume and translate into SQL. Next, you need to use truncate to delete all of the data from that table and then insert the new data. You can use delete here, but truncate is slightly more performant because it's not logging all of its changes. Then for a little feedback, you can return success. Don't worry if something goes wrong, because Laravel will be very happy to let you know that something went wrong. And that's it. Not bad, huh? All you need to do now is go to something like localhost/laravel-db/public. Go to the sync route, add the production connection and the local connection, and then the table users. And that will copy the table users from your production server and sync it with your local database environment. Now you can take this a step further by adding a button you can press to initiate the synchronization. Or you can set up a cron job that every day visits this page and syncs your data. You're basically only limited by your imagination. So great job! In this section, you learned about the different database environments and why having them might be a good idea. Then you got your hands dirty and actually created a local database environment and a production environment on Bluemix. And then you deployed it. Then finally, you learned how to keep all of your environments in sync with each other, and even a couple time-saving tricks to make synchronization so simple that my 3-year-old can do it. In the next section, we're going to learn how to deploy a Laravel application while trying to keep in mind other people who may be working on the same project. Hi there, and welcome to Section 6, where you'll learn about some tools and continuous workflows when deploying with a team in mind. In the previous section, we learned the basics of database deployment. In this section, we are going to be focused on using and learning Git because of its ease of use and popularity. But many of the things taught in this section can be applied to many different tools and situations to help you and your team deploy with ease. We'll look at the basics of Git, continuous deployment workflows, the many different environments, and then finally, we'll end this section by looking at how you might want to structure permissions. This is the first video of Section 6. We'll cover Git basics to help set up the rest of the videos in this section. We'll learn how to create a new Git repository and make our first commit. We'll learn the basics of pushing, pulling, and merging our code, and then also the basics of branching. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing you're going to want to do is open up your terminal and create a new Laravel project. CD into that new project. Now before we do anything with Git, we have to initialize a bare repository. You can simply do this by executing git init. Great job! You just created an empty Git repository. What this means is that although your project has code, nothing has been added or committed to it using Git. So let's quickly change that. So before we can commit anything, we have to let Git know what files we want it to start tracking. We do that with the git add command. You can use a file name to add a new file, or you can use a period instead to track all available files. You can think of the period as a wildcard character. If you type in git status, you'll see a list of all the new files you just informed Git about. Now you're ready to make your first commit. To do this, you can use the git commit command. Now with every commit, you need to log a descriptive message about that commit. If you use git commit, Git will launch your default text editor for terminal. I personally prefer to use the -m flag that allows me to add my message with my commit directly in the terminal. Great, you just made your first commit. So in order to make this available to your other team members, we need to create a centralized repository that is accessible by all team members. Git calls these remote repositories. We're going to use GitHub because it's free and easy to use. So log in and create a new repository. Give your repository name and description. To avoid any possible errors, do not add a readme or .gitignore file. Great job! Now you have a central repository that any of your team members can access. Although before we can push or pull any code, you'll need to set up this remote repository on your local repository. To do that, locate your new GitHub repository's SSH link and copy it. Going back to your terminal, type in the command git remote add origin and paste the link you just copied to the end of the command. You just linked your local repository with your remote repository on GitHub with the name origin. If you'd like to, you can type in git remote-v to see a list of your remotes, and you'll see the one you just created in the list. Pushing code to your repository is simple. In your terminal, you type in git push. You add the remote and branch you want to push to. So your command would look something like git push origin master. Easy enough, right? Now your code can be pulled by other team members to collaborate with. So let's assume for a second one of your team members pulled your repository down and iterated upon what you just pushed. They then push their code to their centralized repository. In order for you to see those changes and iterate upon them, you need to fetch and merge the new code. Just like when we pushed your code, you can use git pull instead and specify the remote and branch you want to fetch and merge. So you can type in your terminal git pull origin master and it'll pull the new code down, merge, and give you a status report. The last thing I want to cover in this video is branching. It's an easy concept to use. It's a powerful workflow to integrate, but you have to be careful because it can also get messy really fast if you don't keep things maintained. We'll learn more about branching in a later video, but for this video, let's learn how to create, push, and delete a branch. If you type in git checkout-b testing, Git will create a new branch called testing and switch the branch you're currently on to testing. So think about what you just did here. You created a new branch of code based on the master branch. Anything you do while on the testing branch will not affect master until you decide to merge the two branches. If you make a change in testing and switch back to master, it would be as if everything you just did in testing was undone. You can push this branch for others on your team to see by using the same push command we used earlier, except this time we'll use testing instead of master. If you want to pull this branch or another branch, you would do the same but use pull. Assuming everything is the way you'd like it to be in testing, it's time to merge your new code into master. Type in git checkout master to switch back to your master branch. Type in git merge testing. Assuming there are no conflicts, your code is now merged and you can push to master for others on your team to see your new changes. In case you're unfamiliar with a merge conflict, these tend to pop up when you edit one line of code and commit it, and your coworker who sits next to you edits that same line of code and commits it. Basically, Git is unsure of how to handle it, so it throws both options back up and makes you manually merge the two commits. I'm sure you can see how this could become a headache. Finally, now that we've merged our branch, we can keep it or we can throw it away. To delete it, you can use git branch-d testing. You need to understand that this only deletes it from your local repository. After you've deleted the branch locally, you must then delete it from any remote repositories you've added it to. You can do that additionally executing git push, your remote, and then colon, and then the branch name. So there you have it. Great job! You've learned some of the basic commands when using Git. The next video is going to teach you how you can apply those commands to a workflow that will improve team collaboration when deploying an application. Welcome to the second video of Section 6. In the last video, we learned about some of the basics when using Git. And in this video, we're going to learn how we can effectively apply them into a workflow that works for our team. We'll learn the importance of using branches when working with a team. We'll learn how to collaborate and iterate, how to deploy and test, and then finally how to rebase and merge our code. So there are many different types of workflows we can go with. In my opinion, the workflow that GitHub recommends on their website at guides.github.com is simple, concise, and it has a beautiful interactive chart. It's a good place to start, and I've seen many teams use this workflow with much success. When you're done with this course, you should be able to take the principles taught and create your own workflow that fits your team's needs. Branching is the first part of any good workflow, and one cardinal rule is that you do not touch the code in master. You can think of the master as the common ground. Master should mirror production at all times. You and your team can create as many branches as you need. I found that you want to keep branch changes small and modular. Otherwise, when you go to merge, you'll have merge conflicts. Let me just say here that merge conflicts are impossible to avoid, and you shouldn't freak out when you see one. You can think of a branch as a new instance of your code. Whatever you do in your branch will not affect the code in any of the other branches until your code has been merged. When creating a branch, you want to be descriptive to other people on your team. So let's assume you're working on the site's navigation. You want to create a branch using git checkout, but you want to give a name like main navigation. Once you've created a branch for a feature or a bug, you want to begin making changes to your code. There are different methods or ideologies on how to handle commits. Some people say that you should commit every little change, and others say you only want to commit major changes. Personally, I like to find the sweet spot somewhere in the middle of the two extremes. You have to be careful though, because commits is how Git keeps track of your changes, and when something goes wrong, the commits are how you're going to be able to revert your code. So you see, you don't want to commit too frequently because then you have a whole lot of nonsense you have to shift through. You also don't want to wait too long to commit. Maybe you wrote a whole entire function and committed it, but you accidentally deleted a huge block of code without knowing somewhere in the mix. The only way to get that code back is to go back in history until before you created that function. So because you didn't commit frequently enough, you may have lost a whole day's worth of work as opposed to maybe just an hour or two. I've also noticed that the smaller and more descriptive the commits are, the easier it is to fix a merge conflict when merging or rebasing your code. So I'll leave this point by saying that this is something that takes a little practice to get it just right. Your commits should be intentional and descriptive. Keep in mind that you aren't the only person looking at these logs. Using a service like GitHub is very helpful when collaborating with a team because it allows you to submit pull requests for review. A pull request basically initiates a discussion and allows the reviewers to analyze the code, pull it down, test it, see the difference between the code it replaced, and then comment on it and have a discussion. If you're not using a service like GitHub, you could liken the step to maybe pushing up your finished branch for others to see, sending your coworkers an email and asking them to review the branch you just put up. The discussion would have to be handled somewhere else. Again, be descriptive with your pull requests and your code. Let your team know exactly what's happening here, making them read your code line by line just to find out what it does before they can see how effective it is can waste a lot of time. I think it's safe to say that you want to keep your pull requests as small and modular as possible. Now, no one is perfect here, but the more modular the code is in the pull request, the easier it will be to merge into master after the code review. The smaller the request is, the easier it will be to fix any merge conflicts, and the easier it will be for you and your team to review. Once you've initiated the conversation with a pull request, it's usually a good idea to notify your coworkers about the new code. Getting a second opinion can help you catch any small errors or performance issues that you may have missed. Another great thing about this section in the workflow is that it opens the door for education and learning. Your team is usually full of very talented people. Everyone has their strong points and everyone has their weaknesses. Keeping discussions like this open for everyone to see and read allows for everyone to learn from a mistake. Maybe you did something in a way that is perfectly acceptable, but maybe one of your team members at this point can look at your code and be like, yeah, this works, but if you use this different technique, you'll reduce your code by half. Once everyone is in agreement that your code is up to snuff, the last thing you need to do before you merge your code into master is deploy your code to a testing server. Just because your code looks great to everyone doesn't mean that it didn't break something. Pushing it to a testing environment will allow you to test it and see if it's working. This is also a great point to get feedback from a closed set of users before releasing it to the world. Once everything looks great on the testing environment, it's time to merge your code to master and deploy to production. The time between creating a branch and merging to your master branch can vary depending on what you're working on. It's very possible that one of your other teammates have already completed this workflow and merged their code into master. that means the master you started with and the master you are merging to are now different. If you're working in two separate files, or even two completely different sections of the same file your coworker was working on, then you're probably fine. But this is where merge conflicts tend to take place, and if not handled properly, they can create quite a bit of a headache. You can fix this by fetching and merging the latest master from remote into your local master branch. Then you can either rebase or merge your branch with master. I find rebasing tends to work better in this situation and gives you a little more control over merge conflicts than just merging the two branches. If you've kept your pull requests small, then you're more likely to remember exactly what you did and why you did it. This will make rebasing your code a lot easier if there is a conflict. One of my coworkers once told me the workflows like this are an art form. To do it perfect just takes practice. But workflows like this, whether perfect or not, improve collaboration, reduce human errors, and prevent your code from being destroyed. Great! So that ends this video where we learned a little about continuous deployment workflows using GitHub. In the next video, we're going to learn about how to collaborate with different environments. Spoiler alert, we're going to make use of Git's branching. Hey there! We are continuing Section 6 with Video 3, Environments. In the last video, we learned basic workflows that led to application deployment. In this video, we're going to learn how we can add different staging environments into our collaborative workflow using branches and multiple repositories and then deploy to a server. One of the best ways to manage your various server environments is through Git branches. At this point, you should have a basic understanding of branches and when or how to use them. What you and your team need to do now is get together and determine what environments you need and their naming conventions. For example, local, testing, and maybe master. For each of these environments you and your team came up with, you should create a branch within your repository and push it up to your remote repository. Your master and testing branches should be protected at this point. And what I mean by that is no one adds or merges code to these branches without review and the proper permissions. And also, GitHub has recently released a new feature that enforces this idea called protected branches. Testing should merge pull requests from your coworkers, and from that branch you can deploy your code to your testing environment. Once it's been thoroughly tested and ready for production, you can merge testing into master and deploy your master branch to production. This should essentially follow the same workflow we discussed in the previous video. The only difference is that there is another level of complexity because instead of just protecting master like we did previously, we're protecting master, testing, and any other environment branches we have. If you want to take this a step further, you can create branches for each release, like version 1 or version 2, or instead you could track your versions with Git tagging. Either way, you want to be careful and not over-engineer the deployment process. So when it comes to actually deploying your application to these different environments, it's really no different than what we have discussed in previous videos. Some people will say with an environment like testing, you want to be pushing automatically daily, but the master you want to deploy manually on a scheduled basis. Now, there are pros and cons to methods like these that you should weigh out with your team, based on project and user needs. When it comes to deploying, you can use tools like SSH that we used earlier, where you just transfer the files to your server and that's fine. My preferred method in this situation is to set up multiple repositories on your server and handle deployment with remotes and the git push command. For an example, you'll have a centralized repository like we've been using so far. This could very easily be on GitHub if you're fine with that. It doesn't have to be on the same servers your environments are using, unless that's what you need and what you want. This is going to be the repository where your team collaborates from, where pull requests are submitted, code review is done, and where code is merged. You'll then want to have a separate repository for each environment on your server. Again, you may see that I'm grouping these onto one server, but you might want to separate these out into separate servers so the performance of one doesn't affect the other. The point I'm trying to make is that they don't have to be on the same server if you don't want them to be. You don't touch these repositories unless you're ready to deploy code to them. Finally, each member on your team will have a local repository on their own local server. You can easily set up a Git remote to your central, production, and testing repositories for quick and easy access to any of the above repositories. When you're ready to deploy to one of the environments, you would use git push, the remote name, the branch name, and you're done. Same deployment methods that we've learned earlier in the course, like gulp tasks or even Git hooks, can be applied in this situation as needed. Again, it's really easy to get carried away with over-engineering and organizing things that you basically create a workflow for your team that is so strict, it's almost impossible to get work done. Use your best judgment here and keep your team, project, and user needs first, and you should be fine. In this video, we looked at some ways you can manage your different staging environments when deploying with a team. With that said, we're going to stop here and pick this up in the next video, where we'll talk about permissions. You don't want just anyone deploying to production. This is the final video of Section 6, titled Permissions. In the last video, we looked at a couple deployment workflows for a team that integrated different staging environments. In this video, we're going to try and pick up where we left off and talk a little about permissions and how they affect team workflows. I'm not going to teach you how to set up permissions because that's a larger topic for another time. This video is going to be more about big picture and best practices that can hopefully get you thinking and pointed in the right direction. When it comes to permissions and team collaboration, I've noticed two different sides. There's the open source, everything, make everything public, and the whole team can have 100% access. Then there is the highly conservative, where only one person has access to things and everyone else is forced to fork and submit pull requests at the mercy of the repository owner. I wish I could say that there is a cut and dry answer to this, but there are pros and cons to each side of the spectrum that you need to take the needs of your team, project, and users into account. You almost have to look at permissions from a repository by repository basis. Personally, I like to find the sweet spot somewhere in the middle of the two spectrums. Now, there are some best practices specifically around deployment that you should consider that is almost common sense. Your team might be relatively large at scale, or maybe it's relatively small at scale. Either way, you usually don't want every team member to be allowed to push to production. You usually only want 2 to 4 people with this type of permission. Now, there may be some trust or experience issues that goes into a best practice like this, but I believe there is a little more to it than that. If you get too many cooks in the kitchen, things can get really messy and confusing really quick. By having only 2 to 4 people held accountable for pushing to deployment, it's easier to track down where something went wrong and you know who to talk to in case something happened, or if you have a hot fix that needs to go live. Now, 2 to 4 people is just a number I threw out there. My point is, you don't want everyone with this type of permission, and you don't want only one person capable of doing it, because what if that person is on vacation or sick and you need something to go live now? The larger your team is, the more you might consider having, while in contrast, the smaller the team, the fewer amount of people you have that type of access and permission. When it comes to merging code, you might want to keep a similar permission pattern going as with deployment. Although you need to decide whether you want the same people doing both the merging and deployment, or if you have a team of people who can merge the code and a team of people who can deploy the code. Try not to overthink it, but do give it a little thought. The tasks can be very similar, but you also don't want to put too much pressure on someone. Also, splitting the tasks up is a way to spread the love and show someone that you trust them. Again, you want to keep this team small because you don't want someone like your new intern who loves shiny buttons to merge something too early and destroy your code base. So the last thing we really want to take a look at is everyone else on your team. Whether you're using a service like GitHub or your own server to host your repositories, or whether your repositories are private or public, everyone on your team should have access to your remote repository at read level at least. They may not have the power to change any settings, merge any code, or push directly to the repository, but they should be able to clone it, iterate upon it, and submit a pull request. They should be able to comment on the code and such. Now, when it comes to actually implementing some of these permissions, it can get a little tricky. If you go to Git's website and see their documentation, they'll give you some tips on the topic. On the other hand, if you use a service like GitHub, they have a lot of these types of permissions already built in. Based on articles I've been following, it sounds like GitHub is getting ready to revamp some of their permissions for the better. On GitHub, the thing to keep in mind is with personal repositories, you have the one owner or creator and the collaborators. Owner is in charge of everything, and the collaborator basically has read or write permissions. If you want to use an organization for your team, which I highly recommend because it's great, then you have a team of users who can write, a team of users who can read, a team of users who are admins, and a team of users who are owners. So that basically wraps up section 6 of learning application deployment with Laravel. In this section, we learned some of the basics of actually using Git, how it can be applied to a deployment workflow, even with different staging environments, and then finally we looked at some of the different level of permissions that our team would need when deploying an application. The next section of this video course is making deployment fun, where we'll look at some of the deployment techniques we learned in this course and look outside of the box for fun and interesting ways we can apply them. Hi there, and welcome to section 7. In the previous section, we looked at continuous deployment within a team. In this section, we'll be making deployment fun while learning application deployment with Laravel. Deployment is often a long and monotonous task. If it's not done right, then it creates a huge amount of stress in your life. This section aims to taking the edge off of the stressful process by adding a little something extra. In this section, we're going to create a simple user interface using Laravel that can deploy our application. We plan to integrating it with Slack's API so we can be notified when the deployment process is over. We'll look into automating the deployment process with cron jobs, how to host our own website on a personal server, and then finally, we'll look at creating an artisan command to deploy our application through the terminal. This video is titled Create a Deployment Interface. In this video, we're going to build an interface around our deployment workflow using Laravel. We'll write a script that deploys our application within Laravel, and then we'll create a form that allows us to select our environment, and then click a button to execute our deployment process. When it's all said and done, we'll have a UI where we can select the desired environment and click a button to deploy. In this video, we'll need to create two routes. One is going to be the back end and handle the logic and the actual deployment, and the other will be the front end with the UI form that the user or you will interact with. So create a new Bluemix app in Laravel project or open an existing one. I so happen to have one that's already formatted for Bluemix. Go ahead and open up your routes.php file at app/http/routes.php. Create a route for our UI. We'll just call this deploy. Let's also go ahead and change the view to accept the deploy PHP view we'll be creating here in just a minute. Create another route that will be a placeholder for our backend. We can call this one deploy/exec. Next, we need to write the section of our script that actually deploys our application. Now this can be done in more than one way. It probably makes sense to use one of Laravel's classes here and keep our code more modular. But for this example, we're going to keep everything within our routes.php file to keep it simple. So we're going to be using the deploy/exec route we just created. To start off with, let's create a variable with an empty array. This is where we are going to store our list of shell commands. Next, we want to use the exec function where we'll pass in our list of shell commands and set the output and status to a variable. Since we'll be using the Cloud Foundry's command line interface tool to deploy our application, we can start off by defining the absolute path to our CF execution file. Now, if you remember in video 4.2, to deploy an application on Bluemix, we just execute cf push and give it the app name into the terminal, and we're good. With the PHP exec function, we can't use cf because we only have what comes standard to the terminal. So by defining this absolute path, we are theoretically temporarily installing the cf command line tool for our PHP application by referencing it here. Now let's go back to our commands array and fill it up with our shell commands. The first command, we need to change our directory to our Laravel project directory. Next, since we're deploying to Bluemix, we need to log in and set our organization and space. We can do that with the cf login. -u is our username or email, -p is our password, -o is our organization, and finally -s sets the space we want to log into. If you remember the .env file from previous videos, that's where I'm storing my password here. Now we want to deploy our application using cf push, and then the git environment variable. The git global variable is going to collect the environment we pass it from our form here in a second. I also have a manifest.yaml file that sets the memory, build pack, and app key for our application. Finally, let's log out of Bluemix to wrap everything up. The last step we need to do is join the array into a string separated by a semicolon. We need to do this because exec only accepts a string. We can add a little error handling in case something goes wrong we might want to know. So let's add a condition that checks if there is an error. If there is, it'll let us know. If not, we can output the results of our deployment process. So without the interactive UI, we could easily visit this URL straight up using localhost/laravel-ui/public/deploy/exec, then a little question mark and env equals laravel-ui. Just be aware that like executing this command in your terminal, it'll take a little while for this to deploy. The difference is that we don't get live feedback like we do in the terminal. Great job so far. Now we need to create our HTML form view. Go ahead and create a new file with an empty HTML template. Save that file under resources/views and give it the name deploy.php so our deploy route can find it. Mark up a basic form with a method of get and an action of deploy/exec. Next, add a button with the type submit. Finally, we just need to list out all of our environment options with a select dropdown. You just need to make sure the value matches the appropriate application name up on Bluemix. To test it out, just go to localhost/laravel-ui/public/deploy, and you should see the UI you built. It's nothing fancy, but it gets the job done. Select the environment you would like to push to and click Deploy. And wait for it to finish uploading. Like I said earlier, it'll take a while for it to deploy, and you won't see any live feedback, but when it's all done, it'll print the output logs for you. Well, that finishes up this video. You have successfully created a simple UI form that allows you to deploy your application. You can take this code and expand upon it to do some really cool things. In fact, in the next video, we'll continue with this example and integrate with Slack to create a notification every time we deploy to Bluemix. Hey there, and welcome back to Section 7. If you remember in the last video, we built a basic user interface that allows us to select what development environment we want to deploy to before we click the button and deploy. In this video, we're going to continue from where we left off. We'll first need to set up our incoming webhook for our Slack channel. Then we'll need to actually build out our notification using JSON. And then finally, we'll send the notification when our application has been deployed. I'm assuming in this video that you and your team is already set up on Slack. But if this is not true, you can head over to slack.com and get set up for free. Before we start putting pen to paper in this video, we need to set up incoming webhooks for our Slack team. Navigate your web browser to api.slack.com/incoming webhooks and click Incoming Webhooks Integration. Choose the channel you would like this notification to show up in. I'm going to go with General. And click on Add Incoming Webhooks Integration. Go ahead and copy your webhook URL because this will be crucial for later steps. Now that we have our webhook URL, we need to go ahead and create the messages we would like to send. We can go ahead and build some of these out and test them in the terminal. If we scroll down to the bottom of the page, we'll see an example using curl. So let's go ahead and begin to write our curl command in your favorite text editor. At its basic level, our curl command that we want to execute looks like curl-x post --data-URL in code. Next, we want to append the webhook URL to the end of this command. Now our actual message or payload is going to go within the two single quotes. And if you look at the documentation, our payload takes a valid JSON object. It seems pretty simple. Let's start off with a simple Hello World notification. Let's copy and paste this into our terminal and execute it. And if you look in Slack, you'll see our notification was sent successfully. That's pretty cool, isn't it? We can also customize the name of the bot and its avatar. To change the name, we simply add a username to our payload, and we can add a regular image if we like, but let's go ahead and make use of Slack's cool emojis for an avatar. We add icon_emoji to the payload. Pretty legit, right? Now that we've successfully sent and customized a notification using the Slack API, we can create a function in PHP that uses curl to send our notifications. So if you don't already have routes.php file open in your favorite text editor, let's go ahead and make that happen. Create an empty function that accepts one argument, message. Every PHP curl session needs to be initiated and closed. We can do that with the curl init and curl close functions. During the time that session is open, we need to set our options. There are a couple of different ways to handle this, but my preferred method is using the curl setup array function. Now, we set our options to an array, and we just pass that array in to be executed. Since we need to post this curl payload, let's go ahead and set curl opt post to true within our empty array. Now let's set our curl opt URL to the incoming webhook URL we created a couple minutes ago. Finally, we paste our payload into the curl opt post fields. Instead of hard-coding the text message, we need to pass in our message variable. And then the last thing we want to do is execute. Now that we have a function that works for us, let's execute our notifications based on whether the deployment failed or not. In our routes.php file, find where our conditional statement, where we either output the results or print the error message based on a success or error. If the status equals 0, then it was successful. So this is where we want to add our success notification. So then our error message belongs in the else condition and looks something like this. We can test this out by going to localhost/laravel-ui/public/deploy. Select the appropriate environment and click Deploy. When it has successfully deployed, you should now get a message in Slack saying it was successfully deployed. Great job! In the next video, we'll look at how to remove the human aspect of deployment with a scheduled cron job. Welcome to video 3 of section 7, titled Automatic Deployment. In the last two videos, we built out a basic interface for our deployment needs that finished by sending a notification to Slack whether it was successful or not. In this video, we're going to look at how we can automatically deploy an application based on a schedule. We'll be using cron jobs for this, so we'll need to agree on a schedule before we can write our code and run it. So cron jobs are in some ways, if not a lot of ways, ugly. I usually try to avoid them like the plague, but if the task is right, then cron jobs can be a real lifesaver. Alright, so before we write and commit out our cron job, we need to first write an executable bash file that will deploy our application. So open up your favorite text editor. The first line of every bash script file starts with a shebang. So let's go ahead and add ours. Let's quickly change our location with the cd command to our application. We should probably make sure we use an absolute path when we do this. Type in something like cd/application/mamp/htdoc/laravel-cron. Next, we need to decide how we're going to deploy our application. For example purposes, let's assume we have an application on Bluemix that we want to deploy to. But any deployment method that works in the terminal should work with what we're doing here. If you're following along, video 4.2 can help prepare your Laravel application for deploying to Bluemix. So if we're deploying to Bluemix, we need to first make sure we log into the correct account, organization, and space. The Cloud Foundry command line interface that Bluemix uses allows us to do this all with one line, so that's going to be perfect. Now that we're theoretically logged in, if you remember, we can just use cf push and give it the app name Laravel-cron. That's it. Our deployment should be done. Let's go ahead and wrap up by logging out of Bluemix using cf logout. You can save the file wherever you'd like and give it a name like deploy.sh. You actually can name it whatever you want, but you want to make sure you give it a .sh extension. Finally, the last thing we need to do is change the file's permission to execute. You can try it out by launching it in the terminal to test it out. We need to make sure it's working before we let this script loose in the wild. So what's great about this script file is that you could stop here and just execute this file in your terminal whenever you want to deploy, and you'd be saving yourself the monotony of typing out those commands every time. If that's what you want to do, then more power to you. But we're going to continue to finish out this video and set up a cron job to automatically execute that script file based on a schedule. Creating a cron job isn't that difficult. The first thing we need to do is open our cron job file with a cron tab CLI. You can do this by typing in cron tab-e. Now this will launch your Vim text editor. This is where we add our cron jobs. tell them when to execute, and what to execute. So let's take a step back and look at the anatomy of a cron job real quick. So the first thing to consider is that you can set up multiple cron jobs, and each one needs to live on a separate line. So every cron job is made up of an interval or schedule for execution, and a script you want to execute. The schedule, as you can see, is broken up into minutes, hours, day of month, and day of week. So let's say we want to create a cron job that deploys our application every Friday at 3 p.m. The first digit is 0 because we want 3 on the dot. 15 tells us it's 3 p.m. The next two are wildcards because these two values aren't specific for our needs. Finally, we want to use 5 to trigger this every Friday. Finally, we need to add the script that we just wrote. Make sure you use an absolute path here so it can be executed anywhere. And that's it. Hit Ctrl+C and then type in :WQ to save and exit. Great job! You just wrote a script that deploys your application to Bluemix, and then a cron job that executes that script every Friday at 3 p.m. You should be proud of yourself. In the next video, we're going to learn how to host our own websites on a personal server. In the previous video, we looked at how to automatically deploy your application. This is the fourth video of section 7, where we're trying to think outside of the box when deploying, and try to have a little fun. In this video, you'll learn how to create your own server. More specifically, we'll look at starting up a server on your local machine, gaining basic network access, and then finally expanding that access to the world. Before we get too involved with this video, I want to add a disclaimer. We're going to be setting up a very basic server from your computer. It's really cool that we're doing this, but by doing this without proper security checks in place, you're going to leave your computer vulnerable. So have fun and follow the step-by-step guide in this video. Test it out, but understand that this should be temporary and removed when you're done. If you like this method of web hosting, then this video should give you enough to go on to research building a legit, secure, and scalable server for your needs. Just be careful and be smart here. Before we can make our website accessible to the world, we need to first get it up and running on our network. This is actually pretty simple. So start up your server. If you're using something like MAMP, you can easily open up MAMP and click Start Servers. Open up the Network Utility tool and locate your network IP address. You can share this address with anyone under the same network as yourself, and they'll be able to see your website. This is great for development when you want to show off some of your work to your boss or another coworker. It's not that great if your goal is the World Wide Web. To set this up so your website will be available for the rest of the world, you'll need to go to your router's web-based administrative interface and set up port forwarding. It depends on your router, but you can usually locate this at 192.168.0.1. Now somewhere on this page, you should be able to find a link called Port Forwarding. Mine was located in the footer links. Once you find it, go ahead and click on it. You should come to a page similar to this one. Now keep in mind, different routers have different UIs, but the settings should be basically the same, so don't freak out if you're not seeing the exact same thing on your screen. For me, I need to click the Create IPv4 button. Paste in the network IP address that we found in our network utility a second ago, and set the proper port numbers. Give it a name or description. TCP is fine. Finally, make sure to enable it. Click Apply, and we should be golden. If you don't know your public IP address, you can search for it on Google. You should now be able to access your website if you type in this IP address into your browser. Now anyone will be able to access inside and outside of your personal network. This means mom, dad, grandma, and yes, even that hacker that lives across the street. There you have it. It's almost scary how easy it is to host your own application on your personal server. In the next video, we'll learn how to deploy our application through the terminal using Laravel's nifty artisan commands. It's great to have you back. This is the final video of section 7 called Implementing Artisan Commands. In the last video, we learned how to use a personal server to host our Laravel application. In this video, we're going to learn how to deploy an application through the terminal using Laravel's artisan commands. We'll look briefly at the structure before writing the command, and then we'll have to register it within our app before we can use it. We'll then deploy our application. If you go to laravel.com and search for artisan commands, you'll find Laravel's documentation on the topic. This Laravel feature is a really helpful tool that basically exposes Laravel's command line interface tool from within the terminal. By default, Laravel offers some great features pre-built for you out of the box. What's great is that it's not difficult to create your own command to use within the terminal. For our purposes in this video, we'll create an artisan command to deploy our application. Before we can do anything, we need to make sure we have a Laravel application created, and that we are in the root directory of it. So we can deploy this out by scratch, line by line, but Laravel has a default artisan command that generates a lot of the legwork for us. Open up your terminal and type in php artisan make:/console and then the name deploy. This creates a new class called deploy based on a predefined template under app/console/commands/deploy.php. Let's go ahead and open it up. Under the protected variable signature, we can give our artisan command a name or a handle. In this example, we'll give it the name deploy. Now, if you wanted to create a group of deploy commands, you can add a colon and give it something like deploy:/execute. I would like to point out here that php artisan deploy is the string you would want to execute in the terminal. Right now, it's not going to do anything because we haven't written our code or registered the command at all. Next, we want to give our artisan command a description so we can remember what it does when we execute php artisan list. So now we have our class created, but before we write our script to deploy the application, we need to register this new artisan command with Laravel because right now it doesn't really know it exists. It's really easy, just open up app/console/kernel.php and under commands add an entry with a path to the class we just created starting at commands. Now, if you go to your terminal and type in php artisan list, you should be able to see the command we just created and registered. To keep things simple, any PHP script you want to be executed must live under the public handle function. Let's print out a basic line of text in the terminal to test that our new artisan command is actually working. We can use this info function to accomplish this. Then we just execute the command and our text should be printed. Great, that means it's working. So let's write our deployment script. To keep things simple, let's assume we're going to deploy this application to Bluemix. So reference video 4.2 if you don't remember how to prepare your application for a Bluemix deployment. We are going to use a similar script as we used in video 7.1, if you remember when we created the UI to deploy our Laravel application. To start off, and to make things a little easier for us, let's create a variable called commands and set an empty array to it for now. Next, we need to convert the array of commands into a string separated by semicolons. We can do that with the implode function. Now it's time to execute our commands with the execute function by passing in our string of commands and setting the output to a variable. The last line of code we need before we start loading up our array of commands is we want to display the output when it's finished executing. Laravel has exposed multiple types of outputs for our needs like info, comment, question, and even error. But for this example, all we need is the line type, and we can pass our output into that. To test everything out and make sure it's working up to this point, we can add echo hello world to our array of commands, and then go to our terminal and execute php artisan deploy. If hello world has been printed, then you're ready to move on. So the final step of our script is to type out the commands we need to execute to deploy our application. Since the execute function can't access what seems to be third-party commands, we can execute Bluemix's command line interface with a direct path to the file. We can set this path to a variable cf, so we don't have to retype it every time. We need to change the directory of our terminal to where our application is living on our local machine. For this example, it would be cd/application/mamp/htdoc/Laravel artisan. Since we're using Bluemix, the next thing we need to do is log in to Bluemix properly. and set the proper organization and space of our application. Now we can push our application using cf push Laravel artisan. We'll change this in a second so we can define what app or environment we want to deploy through the terminal. The last thing is to make sure we log out of Bluemix because we don't need it anymore. And that's basically it. If you move to the terminal and execute PHP artisan deploy, then your application will begin to deploy. Let's add a couple enhancements to make this a lot more interactive and dynamic. So this works fine, but we can't exactly define our application or staging environment. Let's build an option into the artisan command that allows us to define what staging environment or application we want to deploy. We'll also take it a step further and allow you to define the Git branch you want to deploy as well. Going back up to our protected signature, let's append a couple items to our value. So we'll do deploy branch environment. Basically what this says is we want to deploy from a specific branch to a specific environment defined by the user. We need to add one more command to our array of commands in order to change our branch. We can use git checkout to accomplish this. Now in order to access the value you inputted, you use this argument function. So we bring in the inputted branch value here. And we bring in the inputted environment value here. And that's basically it. Go into your terminal and you can specify what branch you want to deploy, to what environment or staging environment you want to deploy to. Give it a minute and you should have successfully deployed your application using a custom Laravel artisan command. As you can see, I deployed my cherry branch to my Laravel artisan on Bluemix. So great job! In this section, we learned some out-of-the-box methods to help us when deploying a website, and maybe even have a little fun while we're at it. We learned how to create our own deployment user interface using Laravel. We learned how to integrate our deployment with a new hot communication tool called Slack. We learned how to forget about deployment and let it automatically do its thing. We learned the basics of hosting our own website. And then finally, we also learned to implement artisan commands in our terminal. The next section is our final section, and we will conclude with some positive remarks, final statements, and what you can do to keep on learning. Hi there! I just want to say congratulations for making it this far. You've done a great job thus far, and I'm sure you will only continue to grow as a developer as we depart ways after this section. In the previous section, we looked at a couple of ways to think outside of the box of deployment a little, and to make the task a little easier or less daunting. Before I leave, I would like to go over a couple more things with you. I want to go over some common problems or gotchas that deploying an application can bring. I also want to go over some of the things that you should have learned throughout the course. And then finally, I want to leave you with some ways you can continue your education. In this video titled, What You Learned, I want to go over some common problems we come across during deployment. And I would like to look at the goals of this course, what you learned, and make sure that we were successful in teaching you. So let's take a second to look at some common problems or gotchas that we come across, or that you might come across when deploying your own application. When deploying an application, especially when built on top of the Laravel framework, you need to really pay attention to software or system requirements. I can't tell you how much time I wasted trying to troubleshoot a deployment problem I had because the system I was spinning up just didn't support Laravel. To be specific, I would keep an eye on the PHP version. Laravel 5.1 will not work if you have anything less than 5.5.9. And if you're using something like Bluemix's PHP build pack that jumps from 5.5.30 to 5.6.14, it can become a real headache. On the topic of Bluemix and its PHP build pack, keep in mind that Bluemix at the time of recording this defaults to the Lucid 64 application stack, while the PHP build pack only supports CF Linux FS2. Now you can easily fix this in your manifest.yaml file, but it was an annoying little bug for me while recording this course of videos. The last thing I'll say on the topic of Laravel before moving on is that you may not have any problem deploying a Laravel application. But if you still can't see your website, A common mistake is that you forgot to point your website or subdomain to Laravel's public folder or root directory. One of the most annoying things I've noticed when working with a team is all of the merge conflicts I get. We talked a little about this in section 6, but I just want to reiterate and warn you. It's highly suggested that you commit frequently and keep your pull requests small. Finally, as soon as you see that the master has changed, rebase your code and keep it as up to date as you can. Doing this will A, prevent merge conflicts, and B, even when it does happen, it'll make resolving them a whole lot easier. The last bit of advice on this topic that I can add is adopting a modular code architecture like MVC will also help you prevent merge conflicts. Laravel has been structured in a way that can help you do this more effectively in PHP. When deploying a database, you need to make sure Laravel is including all of the proper dependencies to allow it to work. PDO and PDO_MySQL aren't installed by default with Laravel. This simple configuration wasted hours of development time for me before I was able to troubleshoot the problem. One last thing to think about is security, especially if you're hosting your code publicly on GitHub, or maybe even sharing sensitive and personal information to make a local dev environment to work with your team through Git. I warn you to pay close attention with what you're sharing with them. It's easy to add a computer password or server username and password just to get an environment running properly, and yet now your whole team, even team members that don't have the right security clearing, may now have access to it. Whenever you put sensitive information in your code, make sure you do it in a way where people can't see it or easily access it. One way of doing this is using environment-specific variables through the command line. Laravel also allows you to set some of this through the .env file it provides. So the goal of this course was to teach you the basic ins and outs of an application deployment process. We kept things high level for the most part, but we did try to dive in and get our hands dirty when it made sense. You learned everything from the initial setup to actually deploying your Laravel application, to some high-level concepts, and then some different ways to make deployment bearable. It's fair to say that you've learned a lot in this course, and no one course is going to teach you everything there is to know about deploying applications. Technology continues to change and improve, so your education must continue also. So in the final video of this course, I want to leave you with some next steps you can take to learning application deployment with Laravel. In the previous video, we looked at the common problems which we might face and what we've learned so far. This is the final video of both Section 8. This video is about what's next. We're going to look at some books and resources, other educational courses, and possible places to find an answer to your deployment woes. If you like this video course, then you might want to take another look at Pact Publishing's site to see what other great books or videos are available for sale. If you search for deployment, you'll find an array of topics and related topics for application deployment. Pact has a video course on deploying AngularJS and a book called Deploying Node.js. The technology in these courses may be unfamiliar to you, and if that's the case, you'll be better off for watching them or reading them. But more importantly, the more important part about these books and courses is that the process and underlying workflows can be applied to any technology. SitePoint has a lot of great articles on the topic of deployment. You can even find an article I wrote on deployment in relation to this video course at sitepoint.com/deploy website using Laravel Git. Craig Butler also wrote a great article on SitePoint on the topic of continuous delivery that helped me while researching for this course. You can find his article at sitepoint.com/continuous delivery, right way deploy software. Stack Overflow is the best peer-reviewed QA site in the industry. It's got an innumerable amount of deployment solutions. This makes it a great place to continue education, but even more important, it's a great place to solve a problem you might be having. Sometimes you can learn the most if you just bite down and read the documentation. Laravel is a perfect example of this. Laravel has a wide number of tools that you can use to help improve your deployment workflow. Another great feature that Laravel provides is testing. You should always be testing your code. I wish time would have permitted us to cover a section with testing, but testing assures at a general level that your code is working the way it should be working when it is deployed. If you read through enough of the documentation on Laravel, you'll eventually come across Forge at forge.laravel.com. This is a specific web hosting provider built by Laravel for Laravel. Many of Laravel's functions and classes integrate seamlessly into this service. It's important to note that in most cases, the best resources or nuggets of information on the topic of deployment are a part of a greater resource. Deployment is such a small but crucial part of building an application, and many books and resources will talk about it in some form or shape. Just know that you might have to dig a little to find some of the best information out there, and when you do, please share it with everyone. And if all else fails, you have at least two other options. You can always search Google, and in fact, sometimes this is often a good first choice. I can't figure something out right away, Google is my first line of action. And if that doesn't work for you, you can also find a developer you look up to ask and see if they know the answer. Sometimes they may not have the answer, but they may know the perfect resource for you to research that will give you the proper answer. So that wraps up this section and the course. In this section, we looked at the common problems that you might need to watch out for. We overviewed what we learned throughout the course, and then finally we looked at how to continue our education in deployment and development in general. Now that you have learned the basics of application deployment with Laravel, maybe you'll get that raise you wanted. You never know.